So unless you live in a place without internet or TV, I'm guessing everyone by now has heard that the book Under the Banner of Heaven was turned into a mini-series on the FX channel. And I'm guessing that there's also a ton of Mormons out there who feel like they just got blindsided by a bunch of obscure Mormon history. Now, I felt kind of a sense of urgency here that we needed to talk about this. So I brought on Ben Shaffer. Now, Ben is kind of like the guy that everyone goes to outside of fundamentalism to get answers. He's very well spoken and he's very articulate. The other thing is that Ben has some very personal experiences that he shares on this episode that parallel close some of the events that are documented in the book Under the Banner of Heaven. I also have on Felipe, and he provides some very interesting context on this subject. Now, in this episode, not only do we talk about the book and movie Under the Banner of Heaven, but we also go over everything from personal moral agency to blood atonement to the oath of vengeance, and even provide a few pointers for navigating these topics if they're new to you. That's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. I'm here today with Ben Shaffer and Felipe. Now, just as a disclosure, these are both men I go to church with. I love these guys and I respect these guys. Having said that, we need to move right into what it is that we're going to talk about today. I believe there's certain points within Mormonism that Mormons have watershed moments. And I really believe that this is going to be one of those moments. I think we saw one back when the Olympics came to Utah. I think we saw one when shows like Sister Wives came out. I think we saw it when Mitt Romney ran for president. And I think we're going to see one now. And unfortunately, this time, it's not so silly as, Mitt Romney's immovable hair or the Sister Wives show or whatever. This is going to deal in some very meaty stuff. So Ben, Felipe, I can't tell you how much it means to me that you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having us over.
Appreciate it. I know, Ben, you went to the premiere.
I did, and the new FX series, Under the Banner of Heaven, I got invited by Lindsay Hansen Park of the Year of Polygamy podcast. She's also very active, of course, in leading the Sunstone Educational Foundation. She got me a invite to that premiere because she helped doing some cultural consulting, trying to make sure they didn't completely blow it on their depictions of Mormonism and Utah and so forth. And I helped her out a little bit. I know people throughout the Mormon Fundamentalist spectrum, a bunch of different communities, and she wanted to know some obscure things like what did it look like in the 1980s in different places, and I wasn't there, but I do know people who were, and so I was able to put her in contact with some ideas for those depictions. And really powerful show. And I think you're right. This is why it's a watershed moment. Under the Banner of Heaven has been in the New York Times bestseller list for a decade or more, I think.
Forever.
Yeah, ever since it came out. And its depictions of Mormonism are dark and terrifying. And, of course, the subject matter is really serious stuff. And yet, because it's viewed as an anti-Mormon work, I think a lot of Mormons haven't really engaged with it. And yet now, I think that's going to become unavoidable. Right now, this is really going to have to spark a really big and important conversation. And I was at the premiere, but it is now available as of today on Hulu. And so I believe that as of today, it's really going to probably get a lot of traction and get a lot of people talking.
And I think I can speak for all of us here that we have felt in our heart that this is why we are working so hard so quickly on this. Because if we don't help to frame our own narrative, we let somebody else do it for us. And
Absolutely.
And that's not to say a narrative in the terms of spin, but that's narrative in terms of truth, right? To be able to talk about these things. At that premiere, do you feel like they did a good job with inviting like enough fundamentalists, enough mainstream LDS, enough anti-Mos, so to speak?
Right. There was actually a really interesting mix of people there. I sat right next to one of the daughters of Dan Lafferty, who's still in prison. And of course, that was very, very difficult and triggering for her. She left as soon as it was over. She just was really broken up. And on the other side of me was Sandra Tanner of the famous Utah Lighthouse Ministries.
Right.
She's getting up there in years. I helped her find a seat. She has a cane, and it's a theater has a sloped floor. So I was like, "Hey, you're one of the matriarchs of Mormonism." Okay, anti-Mormonism, but and she was like, "Oh, well, that's nice of you," or whatever. And I helped her find a seat, and all of that. And then we had people from the Community of Christ. We had some independent Mormon fundamentalists. Mormon fundamentalists from a couple of different communities, as well as myself, of course. And so, yeah, I think that there was pretty darn good representation. Oh, and of course, don't forget the Dargers were there. Joe Darger and his 3 wives are really major icons of
Mormon fundamentalism royalty.
Royalty, basically, right?
Yeah.
The celebrities. If there are any such thing as Mormon fundamental celebrities, that's them.
That's them, yeah. So let's for those who haven't heard, because I was surprised so many people didn't know the story behind the banner of heaven, under the banner of heaven. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a quick synopsis of what happened there? Because it was a true story, right?
Right. And then, of course, the idea of the book is that Krakauer, John Krakauer, the author, wanted to weave this into one grand narrative of all of Mormonism and connect it to kind of its most violent expressions. And this is why it's viewed as such an anti-Mormon work, and why I believe it's actually a work of dangerous levels of cultural appropriation, because as a non-Mormon himself, he played very fast and loose with a lot of the facts, and then created a narrative whereby he could profit off of a different minority that he was not even a member of, or necessarily concerned about the consequences of his actions. Now, that said, I know a lot of people listening are probably like, but I thought the book was amazing. I'm not saying it's not amazing. I'm just saying it's appropriation.
Well, and that's there's definitely some of that in there. Mm-hmm. I happen to be very much a libertarian when it comes to free speech, right? I believe in Wild West free speech. As long as you're not infringing on the right of somebody else, I'm like, go for it. So I feel like Krakauer's got that right.
Sure.
But we also have the right to refute what is blatantly, obviously wrong.
So I guess my point is that in the book for sure, and I'm not sure about the TV show. I've only seen the first 2 episodes that were shown at the premiere. But he does generally conflate all Mormon fundamentalists into the FLDS, which is actually one different sect that actually had nothing to do with the Laffertys at all. So let me give you the basic rundown. Spoiler alert, by the way. You can go watch at least the first 2 episodes on Hulu right now. So go ahead and pause it and watch them if you want. But basic overview. The Laffertys were a mainstream LDS family, very devout, very connected. They became somewhat more radicalized over time. And it culminated in them murdering one of the members of the family, Brenda Lafferty, and her daughter Erica. And for clarity, one of the reasons why this is so triggering and so terrifying is that Erica Lafferty was just a baby.
15
in her
months old.
crib, I think.
Yeah.
Asleep in her crib. And so brutal, horrific murders. And it's one thing to murder an adult. I mean, that's murder mystery dinner theaters kind of can be dismissive about the murder of an adult, but the cold-blooded murder of a baby is a level of evil that most of us never even contemplate being possible. And so it's their story and how they became radicalized and delusional enough. And to this day, Dan Lafferty is alive. He's in the Utah State Penitentiary. And to this day, he not only uses religion to justify his murders, he's proud of what he's done.
Right.
He believes that God wanted him to be a serial killer. And that he's still fulfilling a divine purpose. He takes a huge amount of grotesque, delusional pleasure out of what he's done, even now. And so it's really kind of hard to grapple with that, and therefore it brings up questions that Krakauer in the book brings out, saying, is this kind of delusion part and parcel of religion? Is this kind of murderous nature just a part of Mormonism so fundamentally that, that Mormonism breeds dangerous men? Of course, the real anti-Mormon take on that's really terrifying is it leaves the reader, I believe, at least, the book, at least, I believe, leads the reader to believe that Mormonism is so fundamentally violent in its theology that any Mormon, if they go a little too far, a little bit too Mormon, they will also succumb to the darkness that is the nature, essentially, he believes, of religion in general, and they will become evil, that they will kill.
And it's really a flawed, I'm just going to call it like I see it. It's a flawed idea that he comes out with in that, right? It's a flawed conclusion. Because, let's face it, if you were going to make a true historical movie out of the Old Testament, that bad boy is rated R.
Oh, but
right?
but no, he's not defending Christianity. He's blaming all religion.
I understand.
I think he believes the same thing about Christians as he does about Mormons. If you become too deep in your Christianity, you will become a monster. That's what I think he believes.
Right. I'm just making the point that Mormonism isn't the only religion that has a set of scriptures that depicts wars, right?
Well, certainly. And in fact, I think that's one of the big questions, is that depicting something isn't the same thing as participating in it. What kind of scripture would it be if it doesn't wrestle with the big questions? The fundamental questions. What is life about? What is moral? What is the purpose? What does it mean to become the best that you can be? What is human nature? Anybody who says that they're going to teach you about human nature and they don't even mention that violence might be one of the things that can happen in human nature, that that great evils can't be possible, well, then they're deluding themselves. These things are real. They do exist in our world. War is real. I mean, right now we've got the war going on in Ukraine, and that's not exactly staying local. The concern is how big and how bad is this going to get? And of course, that's a very, very small and localized skirmish compared to some of the things over the last 100 years.
Right.
Millions and millions of people have been slaughtered. The Holocausts, the world wars. And so, yeah, I think that it's crazy to assume that a religion shouldn't wrestle with that. Of course, all religions have to wrestle with the question. The answer is, are we finding a way to peace? Are we finding a way to divinity? In spite of the evils, in spite of the suffering in this world, is religion exalting to the human soul? Right? And I think that Krakauer just kind of misses that. And I don't know if the show's entirely going to miss it, though. For example, in the show, Jeb Pyrie, the investigator, is not in the book. He kind of takes on the role of the reader, becoming a narrative tool to show you through the story. And he's depicted as a loving, faithful Mormon man. And that can, I hope, be, we'll see as the rest of the episodes play out, but I think that that's supposed to show kind of the redemptive side of religion as well, that you can struggle with difficult issues and come out a better man, not a worse man, because you struggled with difficult issues, right?
It'll be interesting to see what they do with that character. Mm-hmm. I hope I'm wrong, but my gut tells me that he may end up losing his faith in Mormonism before this whole thing's over.
Right, which is kind of what you'd expect from the book.
Right.
So
now, I want to be wrong. Right? I want to be wrong. At the end, I want him to wrestle with all these historical questions and come out on the other side a more well-informed Mormon, a more well-rounded Mormon, and a Mormon that also understands human nature a little bit more. Because let's face it, as a people, especially within the LDS Church, I think a lot of things have been sanitized for folks in the LDS Church. And when these things come up, it's mind-blowing. When in our spoiler alert, like I said, I go to church with Ben. In the conversation we had in the meeting, I spoke to the fact that I think that we as fundamentalists may carry a larger responsibility on our backs for explaining this, because the vast majority of 20-somethings within the church have probably never heard of blood atonement, have never heard some of the violence that kind of had to take place in certain instances. I'm not saying in all instances, but in certain instances when it was self-defense.
Well, and sometimes also because we want to make our people the heroes. Right. We ignore and we whitewash any story where we weren't, where we were to blame.
Right. We did. We as
or as a people. I don't mean us individually, right?
No. Right. And so, and I think that also is human nature, right? And that's the battle of history is balancing your ego with what actually went
Yeah,
down.
I mean, how many patriotic military parades would they be if we were going to get nitpicky about, well, was it fully justified in each case? How did this really go down? I mean, horrible things happen.
Right.
But we usually try to make it out like we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. This actually brings me to one of the things I want to talk to about this.
Perfect.
Which is the concept of othering. Okay, the us versus them mindset. One of the big issues with the way we approach this kind of media is that we almost always find a way mentally, emotionally, we circle our wagons and we view ourselves in the hero's role and we view them in, the bad guys, the antagonists as these dark evil forces. They don't need to be understood. They aren't part of us. It doesn't need to be wrestled with. It doesn't need to be confronted. It just needs to be conquered. And so then we rejoice when the hero beats the bad guys. Now, this kind of way of thinking, I mean, it can be fun, especially say if it's a Marvel movie or something like that. You just want to identify with the hero. The problem is that when you wrestle with the really deep questions of life, you have to embrace what Carl Jung calls the shadow. You have to recognize that within you exists the capability of great good and great evil, and that really you can't have one without the other. I believe you may have heard the phrase, a great man is not necessarily a harmless man.
Correct.
He's a man who could be a very dangerous man, but he chooses virtue. And I'm paraphrasing, but there's a quote that goes along with those lines. So my point is that when people view or read Under the Banner of Heaven, one of the most common things that they've done is that they will look at themselves as people who are probably more virtuous than all those bad guys, those bad Mormons, or those bad Mormon fundamentalists, or at least just the bad Laffertys, depending on how you look at it. And then you say, oh, that's not part of us, right? Clearly, that's not part of our culture. And this is one of the big pushbacks when Mormons encounter it. Mormons are going to be wrestling with this because they're going to look at this and they're like, that is totally a lie. Mormonism doesn't have that in it. That none of that is Mormon. And that's what's called the no true Scotsman fallacy. And it comes from the fact that, of course, Scotsmen, again, partly because they were an embattled minority for a great deal of their history, started to have this idea that being a Scotsman meant certain virtues. And then whenever somebody in the community did something that went against that community ethos, did something evil, they would say, oh, well, no true Scotsman would have done such a thing. And by doing so, they simply make that actual Scotsman not part of the community anymore. They say he's out because our community represents these virtuous principles. It doesn't represent that stuff. The problem is that the Laffertys were mainstream, faithful Latter-day Saints. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they served their missions. They were sealed in the temple. They were 110% representative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Okay, so real quick here, a couple things.
I might have to give a caveat to that. So
yeah. So first off, with this idea of no true Scotsman would do it, this idea that people say, well, no true Mormon would ever do that.
Right.
The issue with that is that a lot of them, I think, really believe that because they've never heard the full history of Mormonism, right? And so I'm willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt more than just cognitive dissonance sometimes, in the sense that you just didn't get taught full history.
We actually also have a mechanism in Mormonism called excommunication.
Right.
When somebody does cross that line and we don't want them in the community anymore, we excommunicate them and then we say, oh no, that's not part of us because he's out now.
But he was when he
was doing it, right? He was when he committed the crime. This is one of the things that drove me crazy about recent media. I want to say it was only about a year ago. It might have been 2. There was a bishop in Lehi, Utah, an actual sitting active bishop, and he was a police officer who ran an actual underage sex trafficking ring. And the church wanted to say an ex-member. all of the newspaper articles said an ex-member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints did this. And I'm like, no. He was a bishop, an active sitting bishop, sitting on the stand, taking the sacrament, leading the priest quorum, all of that, while he was committing these crimes. The fact that when you caught him, you excommunicated him, does not change the fact that he did this as a bishop. And then they'd say, oh, well, it turns out that the girls that he was exploiting were not members of his ward.
Oh, that makes
and
it
I'm
better.
like, that doesn't make that any better. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for every person who was spared being a victim. Okay, I'm grateful that these people escaped that, but that doesn't reflect anything about his character. Just about his brains about not being caught for so long. You know, he found ways around getting caught. That doesn't mean that the church doesn't have any capability of recognizing, doesn't have any responsibility to recognize, this is part of our community. This is a problem that occurred in our community, in our church. What do we do about it? Now, the Laffertys, the caveat I got to give, by the time they committed murder, they were mixed up in another group.
School of the Prophets.
The School of the Prophets.
Right.
And it was this far more looser collective than we're aware of now, and actually led to some changes in mainstream LDS church policy against having study groups or groups that, informal Sunday schools and things like that.
It was Harmston, right? Correct me if I'm
no,
wrong.
you are wrong. It was Robert Crossfield. Who
okay.
called himself the prophet Onias. And actually and published a book called The Second Book of Commandments. Takeoff from the original, before the Doctrine and Covenants, there was a book called the Book of Commandments, which contained the revelations to Joseph Smith. And so he's made a second Book of Commandments, which contains his revelations.
And that's why I always have people on way smarter than I am.
Now, Crossfield did pass away a few years ago. There's a guy named Jason Wharton who claims to be the successor of that prophetic line. He and I don't get on very well, though, so I'm not sure what he's up to these days. I've talked to him a few years ago, though. But the School of the Prophets also was not necessarily found to be entirely complicit in this. This was really Dan and Robert Lafferty's own delusions. Okay? So even then, you could say, well, okay, maybe they're not representative of the mainstream LDS church because they're involved with this other group. Let's blame that other group. Again, I want to remind the listener, we're talking about othering, okay? Again, we want to say, oh, they're not part of us, they're part of them. Well, what do you think they did in the School of the Prophets? They were like, we had nothing to do with this. Right off the bat, of course they said that. And I think some of them genuinely had no idea what the Laffertys were up to. The Laffertys also got their own revelations. It's not like, and those revelations, so-called, which were clearly not from God, I need to point out, they never made it into like the canon of this other group, the School of the Prophets people. They never recognized it. It didn't appear in this Book of the Prophet Onias or the Second Book of Commandments. They were doing their own thing, right? So to a certain extent, if we want to other them, we can say this was just the Laffertys' problem. This was their own delusions. And you look at him now, he's definitely clinically insane, deeply insane. And that kind of criminal insanity, it's easy to say, well, that's not part of us. That's just one guy who's off his rocker. But it's still part, not just of the School of the Prophets, and not even just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's part of our community. This happened here.
And one of the other things that happens when we do, like you said, and I like how you put it, the othering, is that that prevents us from looking at ourselves and say, what were some of the warning signs, right?
Right.
Could this happen to one of my kids? Could this, what is this? And in that othering, you kind of isolate yourself to look out for certain signs.
Exactly, because what you do, the first thing you have to do in order to other them is you have to be in denial. You have to say, oh, well, that's no part of us. We don't have to worry about that because that's not something that we do. That's not something any good Mormon would do. And it can happen in your own families. And so this is why I'm going to bring up something that's difficult for me. I've never talked fully about publicly. Your listeners, some of them will know, I've been on various other podcasts and things like that. I've talked about some of this stuff, but I haven't really talked about my brother, Samuel Shaffer. He's in prison. He's criminally insane. He's in the mental health care units there. And that means that he may not be released even after his 25 years he's been sentenced to are completed. He may stay even then, just because he won't be considered deemed competent enough for release. But it happened in my own family. And one of the reasons this is a little bit hard to admit is because I wish this was a story of total success, and it's not. It's a story of my own failures and the failures of my family to stand up effectively against this kind of rhetoric, this kind of insanity. Now, first off, I do want to say I do not believe that Mormonism or any religion can be blamed for its craziest members. Whenever there are, especially schizophrenic type disorders, there is often a fixation on authority. This is my armchair psychologist take on it, but I have studied this some. I'm a lawyer by training, not a psychologist, but they fixate often on authority figures. I have a good friend whose mother was a paranoid schizophrenic, and her mother committed suicide. It was really, really, really sad. She felt that she had to commit suicide because of terrorism. Now, this is not logical. This is insane, right? This is because of her mental illness. She was convinced that the United States government was in contact with her, like subliminally, through codes, through these other things, and that they were communicating with her because there was something important she needed to do. She needed to save the lives of her fellow Americans. And she believed, at the time of her death, her suicide, that if she followed through, she could save them. She could save thousands. So she did it as a great self-sacrifice. Now, that doesn't excuse the fact that it's still suicide. She didn't need to take her own life. None of that was real. She was fixated, though, on this authority figure in this worldview, this delusional worldview, but this worldview, nonetheless, she believed was real. And there's a flip side to that, too. People will do dangerous and then also, of course, violent things when they think they need to, because somewhere in their worldview, it's necessary. My brother Samuel was always a little bit strange, but nothing to worry about, right? He was eccentric. He wasn't evil. He wasn't known to do any violence to anyone or anything. He never harmed a pet or anything like that. And the person we were actually really worried about originally was his wife, Carolyn. She's definitely mentally ill. She's been in and out of the mental hospitals a few times. And again, she has a certain different type of paranoid delusions where she is always worried about, again, I believe this is the authority fixation, she's worried about good and evil spirits. And so instead of seeing, like my friend's mother, instead of seeing the world in terms of government authority and terrorism, these types of threats, she saw the world in religious terms. She saw that Carolyn sees the world as being about good, this dynamic and eternal struggle between good and evil, and these spirits that are constantly at war. This might even be familiar to some people theologically who believe in this kind of spiritual warfare paradigm, which can be a useful and genuine religious perspective. However, again, in this case, it's twisted. It's twisted into a delusional worldview that puts other people in danger. So, for example, she feels like certain objects can be cursed or blessed, and that means they need to either be held close to those you're trying to keep safe, or they have to be gotten rid of or destroyed. So it causes her to commit a lot of petty theft, petty vandalism, and also hoarding behaviors, dangerous hoarding behaviors, where she will keep rotten food or something like that. Because if it was blessed, you can't just get rid of it because it's rotten. It's special. It's got this spiritual power in it. Well, yeah, clearly, again, that's delusional. So if you want to set it up, if you want to set up a straw man and say religion is wrong, religion is evil, well, here's your straw man for you. Find somebody with paranoid delusions or schizophrenia, and they're going to defend what their worldview in the terms of what they believe in. And that's why so many things like the movie "It's a Beautiful Mind," Russell Crowe, A Beautiful Mind. That movie is really about his paranoid schizophrenia and how he views that as part of the government must be asking me, is the way he thinks of it. The government must be asking me to decipher these codes or something, right? Now, he still has a brilliant, beautiful mind. That's the name of the movie. But he also struggles with these delusions. Okay, I'm almost too much set up and I'm beating around the bush now. My brother Samuel definitely had a hard time settling on any one worldview. We didn't think this was violent. We didn't think this was dangerous. Certainly not at first. It was just that he changed his mind a lot. He hung out with some Mormon fundamentalists that were independents. He studied a lot of church history. Actually, he was even just into that even when he was on his LDS mission. He read a lot of neat books. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with those books. Right. I love the Journal of Discourses. But the difference is that he didn't approach it with a regular, healthy mind. He approached it with a certain kind of obsessiveness. He would find one favorite idea and he would beat it to death. It would be the only thing that's important. The only thing that's important in the entire universe. For sometimes months at a time. And then he would switch and he'd be like, no, that's stupid. I don't even believe that anymore. That's just garbage. And he'd throw out the one thing and fixate on something new. And so he did this as he bounced around a lot of different worldviews. Interestingly enough, he stayed a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints through many iterations of this. It wasn't until he became an atheist ex-Mormon that he said that he was done with it and he resigned his church membership in the LDS Church. And so, yes, that was one of his phases. He was an atheist ex-Mormon, and then he became an agnostic ex-Mormon, and then he dove right back into different, more extremist views where he'd fixate on one thing or another that was really important to him. I don't think he actually came back to Mormonism immediately. He regained his theism by discovering the worship of the old pagan gods, the Norse gods, and some of these other religions, and he found great beauty in that and excitement. And I thought, well, that's cool too. Like, I love world religions. I'm interested in all these different great archetypes. But again, that wasn't what it was for him. What it was for him was a fixation taken to extremes at all times, but never steady enough to bear good fruit in his life, to mean something to him.
It was almost like whatever he was studying at the time became so central to his core.
Mm-hmm. And his identity.
Identity that he would sell out for it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Which and here's the fine line, Ben, is that ideally, I mean, us as Mormons, that's what we all strive for, right? Is selling out to that ideal to a certain extent.
And I think that's where Krakauer is potentially right, that religion becomes very dangerous. I believe that anytime you abdicate your moral responsibility, you are in the wrong. I don't care if you're abdicating your moral responsibility to follow someone who is telling you to do what is right. If you're abdicating your moral responsibility, you have lost part of what it means to be a responsible adult human being. You know, if somebody says, you know what, I'm just going to go with it. I'm going to join the Peace Corps or the Red Cross and I'm going to give it my all. That sounds like a virtuous thing, right? Or Doctors Without Borders or some, Oxfam. You're engaged in good works, right? No. If you're doing it morally blind,
right, then
it's wrong. You never, ever, ever do anything morally blind. Otherwise, any kind of evil is possible. And so, anyways, he went through all these different iterations, and he fell in with a guy named John Coltharp. And for those of you who have seen, because I've warned you, you should have already seen it, the first couple of episodes of Under the Banner of Heaven. This became very, very personal to me because John Coltharp was very much, oh my goodness, he's so similar to the Laffertys. He believes himself to be the one mighty and strong. A reference to Doctrine and Covenants section 85 that was in the first episode of Under the Banner of Heaven. Mm-hmm. Only Mormons are probably going to pick up on the reference.
Right.
But he believed himself to be the one mighty and strong. He believed himself to be Joseph Smith reincarnated, I believe. I think, so that he's got that multiple moral probations type of doctrine in his mindset. He believed that it was his calling to unite all the Mormon sects and make them all unite under his leadership and things like that. And he was a dangerous pedophile and extremist, a violent pedophile, and a violent extremist. And my brother Sam fell into thinking, this guy's it. He's the real deal. I should sell out in the sense that, like you were saying, if this is the real thing, I should commit 110%. I should abdicate my moral responsibility. I should do whatever this man says, because this man speaks for God, he believed. Now, of course, he's just another one of this string of delusional maniacs. And we need to get into that, but I'm going to finish telling this story first. So John Coltharp receives these revelations about marriage, which were, well, of course, we didn't know about this yet at the time. He receives these revelations on marriage that basically indicate his belief that, like Jacob worked for 7 years to obtain, worked for Laban for 7 years to obtain a wife, that the dowry and this kind of thing is really essential to getting your wife, that you should work for her. But you can't work for a woman who's already liberated, who's already an adult. So you have to, sorry, trigger warning for the listeners. You have to pick a child, and you have to raise her the way you want her, and you have to work for her father for her, and do service or pay money or both to basically purchase that child as your bride. That's the way he twisted this. He turned this into this monstrous pedophile doctrine. Now, we didn't know that's exactly what they were up to, and this is where some of my failures come in. We did know that John Coltharp was trouble. John Coltharp had said a lot of other things that were just horrible and violent in nature. He would say things like, you have to recognize that I am the Lord's prophet, otherwise you will be destroyed. You know, he used a lot of being destroyed rhetoric. He used a lot of threats and just plain harassment. He came to meetings once for Christ Church. He showed up. My brother Sam, of course, knew where I lived because he was my brother. And so they came to a meeting one time, and he really came just to harass and tell us that we were all wrong and false apostates because we didn't have enough of the Holy Spirit to recognize that he was God's chosen mouthpiece. And so we were like, yeah, we don't do that here, you know. But what did I do? I tried to be polite about it. I tried to be a peacemaker about it, so I thought. I always thought of a peacemaker as somebody who de-escalates the situation, is really nice about stuff, smiles, you know. That's what I thought a peacemaker was at the time. And I got in the way. I got in the way of John Coltharp's kingdom, apparently, when I did those things, when I opposed him. Well, a little while, here's the other thing. We knew that Sam, my brother Sam, and he has 2 daughters, that they were not in a very safe situation. It kept being an unstable situation. John Coltharp clearly had this strange hold over him. But again, it was like the justifications are, well, shouldn't we keep the peace? And shouldn't we be polite? And maybe it's none of our business. But I was worried. And I asked my whole family to come over to my house, all except Sam, of course. At this time, we'd already had arguments about some of his racist doctrines, some of his crazy ideas. I'd warned him, but again, politely warned him, that this wasn't a very good or healthy situation. But what had I done? Nothing really, right? I'd been polite about it. And that was already too much for my brother Sam. He was deeply offended that I would tell him off and tell him that John Coltharp wasn't a good man, and that he was being racist, and that he was being neglectful to his children, and that this did not sound like good doctrine. And that, and I even pointed out to him, because he talked about this, you got to work hard for a wife or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, but that doesn't matter, because you better not be working hard for an underage person, a person who's of age. Their parents have no claim on them. That's just not how it works in our society. And he's like, well, it's the way it should work in our society, and stuff like that. And I'm like, look, women aren't your property. And I told him a couple things like that, but how confrontational was that? It was confrontational enough that he and I had a falling out, And he more or less said, I'm going to spend the holidays with my real family. My true family is John Coltharp, because he is God's prophet. And that means I'll be sealed to him for eternity, but I'm not sealed to you because you're an apostate and you won't accept these doctrines. And that really pissed me off. But again, I was thinking that this was about my relationship with him. I was thinking this was about me being a peacemaker, not about my relationship to a potentially violent situation. So here's what I didn't know. After these conversations, after we had this falling out, Sam and John Coltharp entered into a contract, according to those doctrines, where John would take my nieces to be his wives, and he would take John Coltharp's daughters to be his wives. They then performed their own marriages with these 9 and 10-year-olds, and then once they were engaged in actual pedophilic acts, they knew that they were in danger. So that's when they cut off communication with everyone and everything, and they disappeared. Now, when they did that, apparently they were living in Spring City, Utah, and to disappear, they bought some land, and they moved somewhere in the outskirts of Cedar City. And we just didn't hear from them for months. About that time, I knew that they disappeared somewhere, and that they'd been talking about weird stuff, and I was already worried about my nieces. And so I brought my family to my house, and that's, back on track. My mom, my dad, my younger brother, my sister, my brother-in-law, we all sat down, and I said, I think we need to call CPS. The Child Protective Services, right? The DCFS.
And you're an attorney, so you know that this is opening up a whole can when you do that.
I do. And I am sorry to say, and I probably just have to say it right here, I still don't trust them.
I don't
CPS either. And DCFS, they are unconstitutional, disgusting, prejudicial organizations that are actively engaged in genocide regularly. I know people, several Native Americans, friends and clients I've had, where they wanted to take their children just because they wanted to make those children more white, just because they wanted to destroy their culture and heritage. I've seen them do this over and over again, and frankly, as we get further in the story and you see how DCFS acted, they behaved in a violent and illegal manner, even in this case.
I had my own go-rounds with them that we won't go into here, but I can't agree with you more. I mean, it's
and yet,
I just want to make the point because I know your stance on it. So, and I'm glad you brought that out, because to make you get to the point, you, an attorney, a Mormon fundamentalist, a well-known Mormon fundamentalist,
to want to involve them in my family's life and open us up to that scrutiny was not something I wanted. It's true.
But I think it shows a high level of integrity on your part that you're like, okay, consequences be damned at this point because they got a better shot. Yeah, they got a better shot at CPS. Am I understanding that correct?
Yes,
Ben?
That's correct. And actually, and here's another thing I want to make clear after I've pointed out my position. I deeply regret that I did not do it. My family got together. We talked about it. And everybody kept saying, we can't trust them. We can't do that. You don't have any evidence that Sam or John Coltharp are doing anything violent or dangerous or harming those girls in any way. You can't trust DCFS. You cannot call them. And everyone in my family begged me not to do it. And I didn't do it. But I regret that I didn't do it. It would have been better for everyone if I had done it. And this is one of the things that's hard. We don't have perfect systems, okay? The justice system isn't perfect, and certainly not the Child Protective Services system. It is not perfect. But it's better than letting dangerous individuals get away with it, or turning a blind eye to this kind of violent rhetoric. And the fallout from that is something I can't undo, but I really wish I could go back and just call DCFS, because what they would have done, in spite of the fact that I believe that they handle many of these cases horribly irresponsibly, is still better, because they can do something. And let's face it, they have saved many children from terrible situations. And in this case, they would have been much, much better off. So here's the other thing that I didn't know at the time. John Coltharp got a revelation. Now, famously, I'm going to bring this back to Under the Banner of Heaven. The Lafferty brothers got a revelation that said Brenda Lafferty is an obstacle.
The removal revelation.
Yeah, they call it the removal, that she needed to be removed. And that was their justification for murdering her and her baby. John Coltharp got a revelation saying that I was the obstacle to God's kingdom, that I had to be removed and my daughters taken. And I didn't know it. I found out the way almost everyone in Utah did. An Amber Alert. My phone made the funny sound,
right.
And I looked at it, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It said, suspect Samuel Schaefer, 4 girls believed to be in real danger. And I was like, what the heck is going on? Because as much as I believed my brother to be going down a dark path, I didn't know how dark, and I didn't know how far, certainly. And I thought, well, look, even if he's being irresponsible, I don't think he would intentionally hurt anybody.
Well, and here's the thing. It's all academic till the crap hits the fan.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And pardon the expression, but that's just the truth of it, right? We think about certain scenarios all the time. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to think about it. It's another thing to get the Amber Alert, right?
Right.
And you know, the old expression, crap just got real.
It got really real, really fast. And so I was like, what the heck is going on? I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I didn't have a good number to call him. And then other calls started coming in. I got a call from the Salt Lake Tribune. They wanted to know what I thought. I told them what I thought. I said, I don't think he's violent. I don't think he's dangerous. I don't think he would have done anything to hurt anybody. I don't think he's a bad guy. I've been on the outs with him. We've been estranged a bit, but that doesn't mean I think he'd hurt anybody. He's been in my home. This is the thing with the othering, okay? The first step is always denial. Not the Laffertys. No. They're good Mormons. They couldn't possibly be involved in that. Chad Daybell. Oh, he's a Deseret book author. He does speaking tours. He's a good, respectable man. He can't be a serial killer. Nobody would have thought so, right? And so I was in that stage. And I told him, no, I don't think he hurt anybody. I don't think he's wrapped up in anything illegal or anything horrible. You know what I mean? But that was just my own denial. And this is the type of thing you hear every time it comes up. And this is why we really need to catch ourselves. We need to watch ourselves. Me having been through this, I need to warn you, you got to watch yourself. When it happens to you, if it happens to you, you're going to say, but they were such a nice neighbor. Oh, but they were a friend. The thing is you don't know what people's private lives are. You just don't. Especially when it comes to sexual crimes. Mm-hmm. A person can be legitimately a brilliant mind, a great pillar of the community, very clean cut, always respectful, and a child molester. They can be both. In fact, most of them are. And right. It doesn't necessarily, they can be a great artist and a pervert. There was plenty of examples of these things. And I think that we need to be able to compartmentalize that enough to say, you know what? I appreciate their art anyway. I appreciate the work they did for the community anyway. But I will not use any of that to be an excuse for this other crap that goes on. So anyways, apparently John Coltharp had this revelation. They were setting up their new house in Cedar City area. Note, I find the term compound a little too pejorative. They were basically just building a house, It's not like, I don't know what a compound is except a pejorative term for a house. Generally. So, people always, the Mormon fundamentalists in their compounds. Well, it's about the same thing as suburbia. It's just that we don't like those people, so we call it a compound. Anyway, they were setting up their thing down there, and they'd gone back up to Spring City, apparently, to get some more stuff. And John Coltharp had not been allowing his children, the mother of his children to see his children. They were.
Oh.
I don't know if they were divorced or just estranged. Maybe they were divorced. Anyway, I don't know much about their situation, only as it relates to me, really. But she was looking for the kids, and so the police went to do a wellness check, and there they were trying to get stuff out of the house and disappear, and here's the cops. It was like fortuitous timing.
I see. Okay.
So they arrest John Coltharp when he won't cooperate with them, or tell him where his kids are, or allow her to have any custody or any of that. And then my brother Sam goes on the lam and tries to hide, tries to run. And it made no sense to me. It made no sense to me. Now, they did catch him. He was trying to find some other shelter, some other places in winter, too. So my brother Sam's got 4 little girls, all of whom are witnesses to their crime. All of whom would out them because they've been brainwashed into this. The first thing they would have said, I think, is, oh, yeah, he's my husband, or something. You know what I mean? They'd totally brainwash them into this. And so he's got 4 little girls. And I should point this out. It's not an excuse, but it is context. My brother Sam has had some pretty serious physical disabilities. So he's not exactly the most capable guy, and he's trying to bring 4 little girls in the dead of winter through the middle of nowhere in the desert, somewhere out in the West Deserts, and trying to hide them from the cops all at the same time. So that was not going to work, obviously. Right. And so, somewhat to his credit, he basically ends up turning himself in. He walks out to the road, flags someone down, and tells the cops where the kids are hiding. Because he couldn't keep them safe. They were going to freeze. Right. But here's the thing that enrages me about these religious justifications and these delusions. All I know at this point, of course, I don't know anything about the abuse. I don't know anything about them having a revelation to murder me or any of that craziness. I just know that I get a call. They found your nieces and they found your brother. And they're in Cedar City. And someone, man, do I wish I had a recording of these conversations now, but somebody at CPS goes, yeah, we're not sure what the situation's going to be for them. Maybe they need to be picked up or something. And I'm like, that's like 3 hours away. And it's evening already. I better go pick up those girls. I can't just, have them out there in the desert or what the heck. So I jump in the car. We get car seats from my other nieces, other side of the family, right? And we load up the car and I drive straight down there to pick up the girls. When I get there, boy howdy, is there something weird that I cannot put my finger on. But the police are just like hostile as heck. And I'm like, so what's going on? Where's the kids? Do you need my help? And they're all like, hands on their gun, like, what's your full name? Show us your ID. You know what I mean? Like, not cool with me at all. Look, I'm a lawyer. And they're like, are you his lawyer? I'm like, well, no, not really. He's just my brother. You know what I mean? But I didn't know the level. Know the full extent. I didn't know the full extent of what was going on. Right. And apparently they're interrogating me in the other room and he's spilling, he's just telling them everything. Spilling his guts. He's spilling his guts saying, God has commanded me to molest little girls and murder my brother and all this crazy crap. That's what's going on in the other room. You know what I mean? And they're like, get out of here. You know what I mean? And I'm just like, well, what about the kids? And they're like, the kids are not your concern. You know what I mean? Kind of thing. And I'm just like, holy crap. And I don't hardly know what's going on, right? So the next day, after they're done interrogating my brother, I actually go into the jail and say, I want to talk to him. And they say, what gives you the right to talk to him? And so I did. I pulled the lawyer card. I pulled out my bar card and I said, I'm his lawyer. If you don't give me access to my client, you'll be in violation of the law. And then they said, yes, sir. And they let me do it. So hopefully that's not abuse of my privilege. So anyways, probably shouldn't have put it that way. Don't listen if you're a member of the Utah Bar Association. No. Anyway, hopefully this is a little bit comedic. But so they pull him out and he's like, hey, Ben, how's it going? And I'm like, hey. So I'm talking to him, what is going on? What have you told the police? Do you need me to represent you? Have you committed a crime? What's going on? And he talks to me for a while. It's nice to see you. But then a little bit by little bit, I start chipping away, and he starts telling me, yeah, I'm abusing these girls.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I was running from the cops because I have committed crimes, and I committed multiple other crimes. And then the thing that really just made me want to strangle him, that's one of the reasons why there's glass there, I'm sure. It's not just for the safety of the security of the prison. It's also to keep the prisoners safe, frankly. Then he tells me he fears he has lost his immortal soul because he didn't kill the girls.
What
John,
in the bluest of blue hells? Really?
Yes. So John Coltharp apparently left him with this instruction. If you think you're going to be caught, it is your obligation to kill the girls rather than let them be captured or taken by the authorities. Now, the only reason I can think of that John Coltharp would give such an insane instruction for cold-blooded murder is because he was afraid of being caught for his crimes, and he just thought that'd be a good way to get rid of the evidence. And so my brother Sam says, the true prophet of God told me what God commanded me to do, and I didn't do it. He's like, I just couldn't. I wasn't courageous enough, was the way he thought about it. I wasn't brave enough to do what God had commanded me to do, and now I think I've lost my soul because I can't obey, because I couldn't obey. Now, to some extent, at least that means he had enough humanity that he couldn't bring himself to do it. But the thing that scares me is he was armed, and he was instructed to commit that, to murder the girls. He just felt like he just couldn't do it. He said he felt he was too much of a coward. And I think that that's the one redeeming piece of humanity he has left, frankly. It's the one thing I hope that he doesn't give up on.
He may have confused weakness with humanity.
Oh, he definitely did.
Right. He conflated that last part that was there saying, you can't do this. He had the one part left that the one Lafferty didn't have when he killed a 15-month-old child.
Right. And thank goodness he didn't. He didn't hurt anybody. But the idea that he thought he had to.
Right.
And then to find out from the police after that conversation that I was on that hit list. And my daughters were on the rape list, essentially, was very chilling to find out.
Yeah, you looked the beast in the face.
I did. And I'm sorry to say that, you look into those eyes and you think you see somebody you've known your whole life. I was there at his birth, It's my little brother. You think you know somebody. And all I saw was a murderer, a psychopath, someone who'd completely lost all moral sense. And I kind of, again, I'm really good at diffusing situations and playing nice. I just told him I wished him well and walked out. I handled it really cool. Part of me regrets that too, because I wanted to strangle him. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to defend my family. He's the monstrosity of it and what he was. And of course, because I wasn't firm with him, he then spent the next 6 months writing me letters, which then I started just throwing in the trash without reading, being things like, oh, but don't worry, you can still be saved if you'll support John Coltharp, and God's talking to me in the prison, and maybe this is the way it's meant to be, but don't worry, because soon enough we'll kill all the American powers that be, we'll overthrow the government, we'll all be liberated by this, these terrible things that are going to happen because we've seen it in prophecy, And here he is promoting, once again, additional and continuing violence against the innocent.
Okay. Let me stop there because I want to unpack some of this, Ben. Because what was an academic exercise just became, pardon the expression again, crap just got real, right? First, let me say this. It took a massive amount of fortitude to tell that story. You should be commended on that. 2, and feel free to interject here where you feel it's necessary, but this idea that you failed your brother, I don't buy that. And let me tell you why. This was not yours alone to do.
True, but I have some responsibility.
You look, you do, but I'm going to also say this. Mormons in a much wider context, I feel, have a much greater responsibility in diffusing this crap before it ever gets started. If we don't do a certain amount of policing within ourselves,
right,
it's going to get, it gets ugly. Okay? Let's just look back at the FLDS situation. When everyone started noticing that Warren Jeffs was going off the rails, at that point, the fundamentalists that were, I guess, mainstream fundamentalists, right? The LDS Church, we should have been more vocal. We should have been like, you know what? Theology damned for right now. We'll fight those battles later. But right now,
we should come together.
We should come together and condemn what is going on in Colorado City. And we should do it with as much peaceful veracity as we can and make sure our voices are heard. Because I think that does two things, right? To those who are oppressed and those who are in danger, if they can see, well, you know, I may not agree with their theology, but there's these people out here who say they're Mormons too, and they're trying to help, that at least gives an avenue, right?
It does. And you know, when you think about it with Warren Jeffs and his crimes, if all of the FLDS people had stood up together at the same time when he started preaching that stuff over the pulpit and said, no, look, Uncle, or they call him Uncle, look, Uncle Warren, as much as we love you, you're wrong.
Right.
If somebody had done that then, it could have saved the whole community. Because frankly, way less than half of the community is still with him.
Right.
He destroyed their community so much that the vast majority of people, if they'd stood up at the same time, would have absolutely been able to stop him. But they all had to stand up one at a time. What is it? I want to say it's Viktor Frankl, maybe, talked about how, well, they came for the socialists, but I didn't say anything because I'm not a socialist. Then the Nazis came for anybody who was a Jew, but I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. They came for everybody who was a Mason, but I wasn't a Mason. They came up for each of these groups. And then they came for me, and there was no one to stand up for me. To a certain extent, you know, you're going to have to put a link to that little poem now on this post.
Right.
To a certain extent, that's the problem. You got to stand up together.
Right.
When you lock arms, you have so much power. It's like a union versus one person getting fired. One person can be fired just because they're making true allegations of, say, sexual harassment or unfair treatment or dangerous work environment. You know, one person can get up and say, hey, this isn't right, and then they just get fired. And then they abuse the next person. And the next person stands up and says, hey, this isn't right. And they get fired too. But if all the employees link arms, then the employer has to clean up their act. It's the same kind of thing. Like, there's just power in numbers, you know?
Right. Having said that, there has to be, it always starts with one.
It takes a catalyst.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in courage is contagious. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and I think this harkens back to what we were talking about last Sunday. If you guys ever want to come, I can tell you where to go. I'm just saying. But what we were talking about last Sunday, at some point, we have to make the decisions, every one of us. What are we going to do in those uncomfortable situations? Right. I think back to the classes I took for my concealed carry permit. My instructor was very good about saying, where's your red line? Where's your red line? Because if you wait until the moment, you won't know what your red line is, right? So at what moment, and these are uncomfortable thought exercises to do, but they have to be done so that in that moment, maybe it's you that starts to spread that, quote, virus of courage, right?
Right.
You're patient zero.
Right. And I guess that's the reason, too, why you have to think of it through ahead of time. If you don't decide now, when it's merely a thought experiment, when you're going to call the cops, when you're going to call CPS, then as it sneaks up on you like it did on me, it's just so easy to put off. Mm-hmm. Because it's like, where is the line? Maybe the line should be a little further down the road because I'm not comfortable with as difficult as this is going to be to cross. I want to put this into a much less dangerous context, but a very true one. Thinking about the BYU honor code. Thinking about whether or not to tattle when you're at camp with your buddies and they're doing something dangerous. Oftentimes, one of the reasons why this is messy is because you don't want the scrutiny on yourself either. You're not like guilty of doing anything really bad, but you're not ready to face the fallout of having been so close to something.
Right.
Right? In a lot of cases, say the BYU Honor Code, or being a tattle, being snitches get stitches, they say, right? Because they want to intimidate you into not saying anything. When your friends start doing drugs, or your friends start doing something dangerous regularly, you don't want to be the party pooper. And you know that if you report to an authority, they're going to know that you've already gotten yourself in knee deep, maybe. Not neck deep. And you can see your friends are heading toward neck deep, and this is getting dangerous. But you're in knee deep. You got drunk, or you committed some dangerous act, or you covered up for somebody in the past, and it's all going to come unraveled the moment you report this. That makes it really hard to speak up. And I really need to speak up for Mormon fundamentalists in general, too, because let's face it, there is still very real, very dangerous prejudice against Mormon fundamentalist communities. The Yearning for Zion Ranch raid in Texas, for example, okay? There were crimes being committed there. But none of those were associated with the probable cause or the warrant that sent them in. And don't forget, when they went in, they brought artillery. They brought military weapons because they were ready for mass murder.
Well, Waco.
The Texas authorities were ready to murder every man, woman, child, baby, didn't matter, who got in their way when they went into the ranch in Texas. Now, I'm not justifying Warren Jeffs. He was committing serious crimes. Some of his associates were also committing very serious crimes. There was some really evil stuff that raid uncovered. But you know what? You know what caused the raid? Nothing but some of the blindest and most stupid prejudice imaginable, which should never have been acceptable for a warrant and never should have been acceptable legally. A woman who had read Under the Banner of Heaven and thought the FLDS must be bad people, who lived in Oregon, had never even met a Mormon fundamentalist in her life, called up the Texas authorities on the phone, said she wanted to remain anonymous, but that her name was Rachel Barlow, because she knew that was a very common name in the community, so that's believable. That her name was Rachel Barlow, and that she was 16 years old and she was being forced to marry an old polygamist man. That's what it was. It was that phone call. She had no knowledge of actual Mormonism. She had no knowledge of actual Mormon fundamentalism. She had no connection to the community at all. She was like a 34-year-old woman who read Under the Banner of Heaven in Oregon. That's what launched a genocidal level raid against an entire community. And don't forget, every one of those innocent mothers had their children, their babies, torn from their arms. And the Texas authorities said that it was their objective to eradicate the disease of Mormon fundamentalism. They wanted to commit genocide, essentially, against the entire culture and the entire religion. And they didn't care what the fallout was. It wasn't until some reasonable and wise judges, and this is why I do have some faith in the judicial system still. As a lawyer, I still think there's some real redeeming qualities in here. They started bringing up this actual evidence, starting to look at how are we going to place these children in non-Mormon families so that we can eradicate this Mormonism from our community. We need to eradicate the religion. So in order to do that, we have to re-educate all these children. So that was literally their whole design. And a judge said, wait a second, what cause do you have to assume that there's any crime that's been committed in this family? And they kept saying, we don't have anything, essentially, that met legal muster. And so the judge ordered, no, you have to let the women and children go. You can only continue to hold people if you have some probable cause of a crime. Now, did they find crimes there in Texas? Yes, they did, because Warren Jeffs has committed some very heinous crimes. And that's where, fortunately for, criminals are so dumb. I mean, I can't get over this when I'm doing criminal defense. I can't tell you how often criminals are so dumb. But Warren Jeffs is a dumb criminal. He basically recorded in detail all of his crimes.
Right.
And then left records of all of his wonderful crimes because apparently he was proud of them. It's the same thing with my brother and John Coltharp, honestly. He spilled his guts to the police. He told them everything. And on top of that, they wrote it all in a book and handed it to the cops. Right. So, there's no defense for that sort of thing. But what's my point? My point is that fear of very real, very serious consequences, especially in the Mormon fundamentalist community, is not unfounded.
No. Look, let's face it. The reason that Warren Jeffs could do what he did was because of the Short Creek raid.
Right.
The
1953 Short Creek Raid basically taught that entire community, you are not citizens of the United States, you have no rights, and you should fear them because they will destroy you. And they will hurt your family.
This is part of the problem when you force something like plural marriage, someone's lifestyle choices. Look, obviously, I'm a Mormon fundamentalist. I'm not super sympathetic in terms of the homosexual lifestyle. Having said that, that is your right to practice if you so deem fit, and you shouldn't be forced to live in the shadows for it.
Right. Or legally harassed.
because bad things happen when you force people into the shadows. And we saw that with prohibition. We saw that every time we go that direction.
Well, and especially anytime there's prejudice against any minority.
Right.
Prejudice, anti-Semitic prejudice, even just apartheid or segregation. What happens? You separate those communities out and then you other them. They're not one of us. They're not deserving of rights. And then you can harass them. You can harm them with impunity, right? And right now, to this day, Mormon fundamentalists are othered, especially in the state of Utah. And so people aren't concerned if you are targeted or harassed or harmed. People assume that you deserved it because of that prejudice, right?
And it speaks greatly to my lack of intelligence that I decided to do a podcast,
right?
And just came out.
And that's one of my problems too, right? Being a very open Mormon fundamentalist, it puts a target on my back with certain individuals. Absolutely.
However, there is something to be said. It's a little tougher to take someone out in the light, right? If you there is some safety in the sunlight.
There is, in fact, and that's why they say sunlight's the greatest disinfectant, because it stops a lot of this bad stuff from happening. So, but my broader point is, it doesn't matter. Even if you're FLDS, there still needs to be a red line where you say, I'm calling the cops, even though I don't trust them. For example, I said earlier, I don't trust the Child Protective Services of Utah. They do not follow even their own rules whenever prejudice gets in the way. And they're a prejudice organization, especially against Mormon fundamentalists. But I still wish I'd called them. Because they're not fundamentally evil. They have misconceptions. Some of them are very poorly trained. Some of them are just plain overworked. So sometimes they'll make bad decisions because it's the heat of the moment. They just got to think they got to do what they got to do. But even then, something's better than nothing. And even if it brings scrutiny to me, one of the things that I'm worried about is because of that prejudice, I was afraid that they were going to investigate and harass my family just because we pointed them in the direction of my brother's family, right? Because if there is something wrong in his family, we would have hoped that we would have had the opportunity to bring my nieces into one of our families. My family, my sister's family, one of us should have been on the list at least for taking custody of our own family members if he's an unfit parent. Well, we didn't know how unfit, but even then, shouldn't we have been consulted? And that is their policy, that people should be placed with family unless they're prejudiced against that family's lifestyle or something. And sure enough, because my brother Sam was spouting this, insane, delusional, but religious rhetoric, CPS cut us out completely when that happened. They never interviewed any of us. They never talked to any of us. They stonewalled us at every possible turn. Everyone. Didn't matter if they were mainstream LDS, like my mother, who, as their grandmother, would have been a very reasonable choice to take care of her own grandchildren. They would not even return her phone calls. They wouldn't open her letters. They had nothing to do with her because of Sam's rhetoric. They just assumed, oh, he's one of the others. Because Sam is involved in some kind of quasi-religious craziness. And, of course, don't forget, this is southern Utah, where there's a huge amount of prejudice against the FLDS. Sure. They're just lumping them all into one thing and assuming that means they don't deserve the regular legal rights that other people have. And so they absolutely violated all their own policies and cut us out completely. And then they did the other thing, too, which is that they want to make sure that any kid who comes out of that other group gets re-educated into the in-group. Right. And so my nieces, for example, if you're worried about them from my story, are actually in a pretty good situation now. But it reinforces all of these problems and themes, because the whole point was these social workers had decided that this good LDS family deserved more children. And they had already decided that the next couple of children that came up as being available, which of course they decide what children are available, were going to go to that family. They just made that decision before they even knew my brother Sam had moved into the county. They had already prejudged, which is the root term of prejudice, that as soon as they could get children out from another group, they were going to give them to this in-group person. Now, that in-group family, I don't blame them individually, but here's the crazy thing. My brother and John Coltharp are in prison for kidnapping. What did CPS do? How is that functionally different in any way than kidnapping? They had a premeditated plan about how they were going to take children from one culture or society and put them in another and re-educate them, and exactly where they were going to go and what they were going to do with them, and then they seized them by force and delivered them to their purposes. Now, don't get me wrong. People say, well, that can't exactly be kidnapping because their motives weren't bad motives. And that's why this is one of the reasons why I think we need to re-examine ourselves, and I want to call bullshit on that. I don't care what your justifications are. Violence is wrong. I don't care what excuse you're going to use, or law you might try to hide behind, or profit you might try to hide behind. If you are using some kind of rules or instructions or something to abdicate your personal moral responsibility and do violence to another person or family, that's evil. And it needs to be called out, no matter where it's found. If it's found in a church or a government or the policies of your employer, it doesn't matter. You have to say, we all have to stand up and hold up our hand and say, no, I will not participate in a system of violence. It reminds me of one of the things I was asked when I was asked online recently, just yesterday, about my brother. This is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it on the podcast, because he said, two people. One person said, well, how can you talk about standing up against this kind of evil? What, did you stand up to your brother? And it's like, I tried, I did, but I didn't do it strongly enough. And for that, I'm sorry. But another person said, well, you can't always talk that way. What about Abraham? God commanded Abraham to offer his son Isaac. Would you have opposed the prophet today? And I'm like, yes, I would. Because we identify ourselves wrongly. This is the problem with othering the other group, the us versus them, the them group. We misidentify these scriptural stories and how the lesson we're supposed to take from them, because we misidentify who we are supposed to be in that story. In the story of Abraham offering his son Isaac, we get taught in, like, for example, in LDS curriculum, that we should contemplate that story, and most of the discussion goes that we should contemplate that story of, are you willing to obey God in all things? Is the lesson we're supposed to take from that story. I don't think that's the lesson we're supposed to take from that story. I think the lesson we're supposed to take from that story is you should be like the angel who had more knowledge than Abraham. You should be like the angel, and you should be willing to stand up right in front of the prophet of God and say, no, you're wrong. Stop what you're doing right now. It doesn't matter that Abraham had some kind of authority. The angel was the one who was in the right there. And we need to have that kind of courage, even if there's fallout, right? And it's hard. It's hard to say to your church, you're wrong. I'm sorry, but you're just wrong about this, and I won't put up with it anymore. Especially because we're taught so much about obedience in a Mormon cultural mindset. And a lot of that comes from the way that we circled our wagons and tried to break a very harsh desert and make it blossom as the rose and build this Utah kingdom out here. We needed each other. We needed a strong sense of community. But the problem is, you can have a community without abdicating your moral responsibility. Too many people got lazy and didn't exercise their moral muscle and just thought, I'll just do what I'm told. You do that for a few generations and people lose the moral strength that it takes to stand up and say no.
And not only that, I believe Joseph Smith said that one of the major faults with the children of Israel is that they didn't want to meet the Lord face to face. They wanted to have Moses there. They were more than willing to abdicate that moral responsibility,
right, all the way back then
to Moses. This is a very human problem
this
that we see play out over and over. Sometimes it results in very, very dark things like we see with the Laffertys or things that happen to your brother. Other times we see it with God in a sense of frustration, like, I want you with me, right? And now, and I think we should preface this. We all three of us belong to a church where we recognize and sustain
prophetic authority.
We
do, yes.
But I'll say this: nowhere in that, in my times in hearing that man speak, have I ever once heard him say, "Just trust me."
No.
Right. In the sense of
but
that,
that can be a difference between our church and other churches, though, because I have heard that in plenty of other Mormon sects.
Well, right.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, and I remember one talk he did give. It was the first time I was there, where he said, "Oh, if you all could be prophets." Right? If you could, so
it's a meaningful memory for me, even though I don't remember what the deal was. He was really excited about a gospel principle in one of his talks. This is 5 years ago or something, before either of you were members of Christ Church, actually. It was like 5 years ago. It was in a solemn assembly meeting there. And he overstated something. And I was looking at the dangerous implications of overstating something. And I raised my hand. And I said to the prophet, in the middle of his speech, because we do that, by the way, in Christ Church, you can raise your hand and make it a discussion. So in the middle of conference, or solemn assembly, basically, I interrupted the speaker, who was the prophet, and said, "You took that too far. You got to roll that back in again, because there's dangerous implications of taking certain gospel principles outside the bounds of where they fit." Instead of being excommunicated or shouted down, like, "Boo, you're not sustaining the prophet," right? It was so meaningful to me that he said, "Thank you, Brother Benjamin. That's helpful." And then he restated, and he got back on track with his talk, and it wasn't a big problem. But that memory means a ton to me, because I was raised in the mainstream LDS church. I'm pretty much as mainstream as they come for my whole upbringing, so I'm very familiar. I never would have dared do that in general conference. Sorry, Brother Russ, you're wrong about that.
I believe he goes by Rusty.
Rusty.
I could be wrong.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, even if you just called him Rusty, it'd be like blasphemy.
I know.
You can't even just call him Russell Nelson. You have to use the Russell M. Nelson.
Right.
As all of the honorifics and stuff like that we do, all the hero worship that goes into that in our LDS culture. It's such a relief to kind of feel that I've broken free of that. But that, I think, is one of the first steps to taking back your moral agency. And this is really something I think that everybody has to do at some point to truly be an adult.
Right.
When you're a child, you're used to obedience just means I do what I'm told. But at a certain point, adulthood means I'm doing what I know is right. And to make that shift from I do what I'm told to I do what I know is right, you have to take back some of your own power. I think this is one of the reasons why, even though sometimes they're responsible, teenagers have to rebel a little.
Oh, yeah.
Because they have to be their own person. They have to be able to say, no, I have control over myself. I'm not just an extension of my parents. I am a person who has their own choices to make. And so hopefully you don't make too many really bad choices when you're just trying to figure out how to make choices. But you've got to learn to make choices to be an adult. And I felt like when I came into Christ Church, it really broke that spell for me for the first time really in my life. Before that, I was a mainstreamer 110%. And I was absolutely ready. And this is why it can be a dangerous thing. Sorry, Krakauer, for giving you such a hard time, John. But John Krakauer basically said this is his main thesis as to why he thinks Mormonism breeds dangerous men, was his phrase. In other words, makes us more dangerous. Really was about, I believe, from what I read, is that I believe what he really means is anyone who's abdicated their moral responsibility to an authority figure is capable of great evil. You know what the most common complaint, most common defense during the Nuremberg trials and things like that was always just following orders. It's not my fault. If you look at the Milgram experiment, for example, they
shocked them. And, Yep.
They shocked people and things like that. The people who, most people, the majority of people would commit heinous atrocities because they felt that they were commanded to by an authority. And so they didn't realize that they have personal agency in that situation. And it was reading the Milgram Experiments. It was reading an excellent book by Jacob Newman. He's forgive me politically, this isn't a political comment, but he's at UC Berkeley. But he is the commies at UC Berkeley. But anyways, he's not a political scientist there. He is a philosopher. He wrote a book called Why Can't We Be Good? And it was an examination of not just the pure philosophy of reason of what is good and evil, but why is it that so often we fail to live up to our own ideals? Most human beings never live up to their own ideals. And why is that? Right? So anyways, I read some of those books, and it really made me think, no, I have to exercise this muscle, that I have a choice in all these situations. When someone comes into church, like John Colthart did, to be disruptive and to say violent rhetoric, it was easier at first to just kind of abdicate that moral responsibility to do anything about it, because it's like, look, he's just a weirdo. He can go his way, I'll go mine. It's not my problem. Or we can agree to disagree, kind of thing. And there's room for compromise in a lot of our discourse that we need to. There's a lot of places in our discourse where we should compromise more. But I've realized when you're dealing with the types of false doctrines that lead to violence, I no longer believe that we can go along to get along. Right. We must boldly stand up. And if you overhear it, even if you didn't say anything, I think that you're under moral obligation to speak up. It reminds me of a case that was a racist situation. I have a lot of friends who are Sikhs. I actually delved deep into Sikhism for a while. And right after September 11th...
Right, they were targeted
They were targeted heavily. And which is crazy, of course, because Sikhism, they do wear turbans usually because they have this principle called kesh, which means that their devotion to God means that they will never cut their hair. Right? Which makes the turban the easiest thing to do, because if you have a man who has floor-length hair, okay, that's basically what's under that turban in most cases. You can't just leave that out very easily. Right. Okay, right? So there's a way that they put up their hair and they put it in a turban. And unfortunately, ignorant stereotypes, a lot of Americans associated turbans with Muslims, even though they're not even Muslim, for goodness sakes, right? A friend of mine, it was a really sad case, just after September 11th, was murdered in Phoenix.
Oh, jeez.
And it was a hate crime. It was a hate crime. They targeted him because he was wearing a turban. And I think he was killed September 12th or 13th, 2001. I was on my LDS mission at the time. I found out after I got back, and I'd met him just before my mission. And so those kind of hate crimes, though, they don't happen in a vacuum. It happened because of September 11th, and before they committed murder, they committed these types of verbal cues that they were leading up to it. Okay?
Right.
And so, for example, they had gone around and they had started calling them towel heads,
right,
as a derogatory racist term or a violent hate term. They were calling them towel heads. I do believe that even though that freedom of speech means you can use racist slurs all you want, but you know what else we can do? We can stand up to the people who use them. If everybody he had said towel head to that week had said, stop right there, that is not appropriate. There are plenty of people of various backgrounds that wear turbans. It has nothing to do with that. Don't be a bigot. If people had stood up to him, it wouldn't have escalated in the same way. Now, I don't believe that we can or should criminalize speech, but I do believe that when we encounter violent speech, especially in our churches, especially in Mormonism, where we have a strong obedience ethic, I think it's our moral obligation to stand up and say, no, stop right there. We are a people of peace. The gospel is a gospel of peace. We're not going to talk like that.
I think you're right. And I want to go back to something here real quick. The reason I brought up the fact that all three of us believe in prophetic mantle and prophetic hierarchy is to show that you can have that belief and vigorously sustain a man in his prophetic calling, at the same time exercise
right
that muscle. The other thing,
in fact, they're not contradictory at all.
No, they're complementary.
They're both necessary.
Right.
They work together.
Yep. And then the other thing I wanted to speak on here just for a second is this clarification on peacemaker.
Okay. Yeah, I brought that up earlier.
Right. And so you said, well, I've always tried to be the peacemaker, right? There's two ways to make peace. We think of it in one way, which is to be
apologetic, to be deferential,
passive, deferential.
Dude,
what's that?
Drew would be like the hippies.
Yeah, the hippie guy or whatever, right? The other way is to be the guy that sees danger on the horizon
and speaks up
and is like,
confronts it.
It's like, no, we're going to go confront this now, because if we don't confront this now,
what are we going to be dealing with later?
Right. So there's two forms of peacemaker, and I think they're complementary. They're not opposites in the sense that they're against each other, or they can't occupy the same space. Ideally, you want one guy who is like Gandhi, who's talking about, or Martin Luther King. We're just going to sit and take it. And then there's times you need the other guy that's like,
we're going to kick some butt.
we're going to go have this argument. We're going to meet on the battlefield of ideas, and we're going to have this out so that we can put this down now.
Yeah, we've been putting him off for too long. I want to speak to this for a minute. I am a pacifist. I come from a long line of pacifists. Before we were Mormon, many of my ancestors were members of what is called the Church of the Brethren. It was one of the Anabaptist movements, a pacifist movement that came out of Bavaria. And I've always believed very strongly in absolute and complete pacifism. When I turned 18 and I was eligible for the draft, I got a draft card in the mail to fill out, and I just wrote conscientious objector in all caps across the front of it and turned it in. Right. I've always been very, very strongly in favor of total pacifism. It's actually been a struggle for me that in Mormonism, we don't always glorify pacifism. Sometimes we glorify violence. But here's the difference. They can coexist. Helaman was this leader who respected the Ammonites' pacifism, and he even told them, you must never break your oath. You should remain pacifist, even in the face of war, even in the face of invasion. Do not break your oath. Stay pacifists. And he taught them that. But those who hadn't taken the oath, he mustered together those stripling warriors, right? And then they went out and they saved their nation. So there was both at the same time, and I think that both can exist. So I guess I wanted to bring that up because I'm a pacifist, and I've always been absolutely against any form of military service or military's existence. But I've got my brother here, Felipe, who's in the military. And so, what do you think about some of this stuff?
Well, I'm not a pacifist, obviously, but I'm not a violent guy.
Right.
Like, if you were going to ask what my political views are in foreign policy, I tend to hold the old paleo-conservative view, like non-interventions, But when it comes to our culture, we're a violent culture, which is sad.
They say the number of murders committed on television is some massive orders of magnitude more than the numbers of killings that actually take place in the world. Right? So there's more fake murder that we use for our entertainment than there is. So there's a certain amount of glorification of violence in our culture, right?
We just traded the Coliseum for TV.
I mean, this country has a fetish for violence. That's the issue. I mean, I don't. The only violent show I probably watch is Band of Brothers. That's about it. But if my wife were to tell you, I don't really watch a lot of violent television. I don't even watch a lot of television at all. But if you were to ask me what my views on violence is, it should always be the last resort. There's an author, Jack Donovan. He wrote an essay called "Violence is Golden," and to paraphrase it, he said, "Without violence, laws would just be words." It's part of our nature. Does not mean we have to use it. I mean, I didn't join the military for mercenary purposes. I joined it for my patriotic duty. But I've never met. So far haven't ran into a soldier who's looking forward to going to war and killing somebody. I mean, they joke around, but when I was a basic training, we had a sergeant major come into our company and talk to us. Don't be scared. These guys are going to train you if you have any questions. All the kids they asked him, so how's war like? How does it feel to kill somebody? And he dodged the question. And then when he left, one of our drill sergeants said that's a question you never ask because it gives them PTSD. That's something he said that's not something they're all proud of. Like none of them go off write in their book. I just killed an insurgent. I'm so proud of myself. A lot of them have a guilty conscience in the sense. They dare to defend their brothers in arms. Now, whether or not you agree with the war, that's another thing. But they're there to look after each other.
And it might have been necessary, right? But that doesn't mean that most anybody wants to ever be in that situation where it becomes necessary.
Look, I don't think... Look, are there some guys that are full of bluster? They are. But those guys who are full of bluster very rarely have ever been in a fight. I have a good buddy who is damn good at jiu-jitsu. Scary good.
Oh, yeah?
Right? But that dude is the most peaceful, most loving man, one of the most loving men I've ever met. But I've seen on a few
he's
occasions.
capable. Yeah.
I've seen on a few occasions, which goes back to what you originally said, which was a good man isn't a weak man. A good man is a dangerous man who has it under control.
Right.
Right?
And I think that's what morality is, right?
Yeah.
Morality is when you make your own decisions because you actually have it under control.
Yep. And so we see in certain instances in the scripture, right? The same scripture that they use, that Krakauer uses where Nephi slays Laban, is the same scripture I'll use to defend this idea of Nephi didn't want to do it. Let's remember, Nephi argued with the Lord there a little bit, right?
Right.
So it's not, if you're lining up, signing up, going, send me, you're probably not the guy for it.
Right.
Well, we don't want masochistic, violent people in the military. That's one thing, because those are usually the soldiers who are going to snap and probably commit war crimes and give us a black eye.
Yeah.
I mean, we're taught to treat these like my military job is not a combat job, but they can send me to combat. But it's always to treat the enemy humanely as possible, like no torture, treat them as a human being, which is something I agree with. But
and again, that has to be the type of thing you have to stand up for. I have another story on that.
Sure.
It's a trigger warning to anybody who served in the military, for sure, on this one.
I'm trigger ready.
My trigger ready. There you go. My wife, Wendy, my ex-wife, actually, one of her best friends growing up, her name was Alyssa Peterson. She's somewhat famous in these circles if you study the Iraq War. She was an interpreter. That was her job. She was very gifted with languages. She picked up Arabic very quickly and Farsi and some of the, she was very, very good at that sort of thing. They wanted her to interpret, and they had her at a black site prison with something they called the cage, which was a torture environment. And they brought her in there to interrogate and interpret for the interrogation while they committed war crimes against these people. This was the same exact time as Abu Ghraib and some of these other abuses. And they brought her in to interpret, and she did it that one time, and then she told her superiors that she refused. She said, I will not cooperate, I won't go in there. From what I understand from the fallout, and this is only because of some of the additional commissions that took place, as well as some of the stuff that was revealed by Manning and Snowden about how they got some of this information out. Apparently, her superiors, knowing their criminal behavior, they wanted to cover their criminal behavior. So they forced her not to say anything. They put her in a really tough situation, but she continued to refuse to participate. And with that much pressure on her and the fact that they couldn't allow her to leave, they couldn't allow her to get a dishonorable discharge or go to any other unit, because then she'd be able to reveal their crimes. They put her under a lot of pressure, and she was already she was gifted with languages, but I don't think she was cut out for the brutality of real, especially torture. She was not exposed to the nicest type of war either. She was exposed to some of the most ugly things of humanity. The pressure was too much, and she actually killed herself. And so she was one of our, first 100 dead in those wars in the early 21st century. And, to this day, her mother has a hard time even accepting any of what happened to her. And I guess that's the thing. To me, she's one of my greatest heroes, though, because she said no. Right? She said no to the point of death. Even if I wish that she'd had the strength not to take her own life, at least she was strong enough not to be complicit anymore.
Right.
And I think it takes practice. I think we have to practice that. We have to mentally practice, when do I say no and why? And if you know when you're going to say no and why you're going to say no to certain things, you're not gonna get that far down. You're going to stop it before it escalates.
I go back to my concealed carry training, right? Which is know your red line. Because here's the thing. I don't constantly worry about my red line anymore. It's been defined. I know where it's at.
How do you decide where it is? Walk me through that. What do I do? How do I make up this red line? Where's my red line?
So for me, in concealed carry, we'll just use this as an example. What is the line at which I'm ready to discharge my weapon? Okay. Right. Is it when some guy is leaving my house with a television? No, that's not it. Is it when I have him at a clear disadvantage and he is surrendering? That is not a red line. I'll tell you where my red line is. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Hour really doesn't matter, but just hypothetical. 3 o'clock in the morning. Dude's in the hallway, walking towards a room. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to assume at that point that it's a worst case scenario. I am going to say once, I have a weapon. Stop.
And if they continue to
approach, I will discharge my weapon. So I've thought it through. I thought if I'm in a store.
I have thought about, you're reminding me of something. You're reminding me of something interesting that I want to bring out here. One of the biggest problems with our glorification of violence in our culture that drives me crazy about that red line issue is all the Mexican standoffs, they call them, or all the times when someone doesn't obey an order. You see this constantly in television shows and whatnot. Someone pulls out their gun, a police officer or somebody has to pull their gun. Somebody's in a dangerous, threatening, violent situation. And they say, stop right there, I'll open fire. They give them a verbal warning and everything like that, and then the guy rushes them and they don't fire.
Yes.
Or someone pulls out a gun and says, I'm going to kill you now. And then the other guy pulls out a gun and says, well, what about now? It's like, no, those are not situations where any rational human being is going to have a conversation, continue to run, or any of that. And I feel like that mistrains our minds. Our minds fixate on that, and then we think, I know, guns, you point a gun to assert authority in a situation. It's like, no. If you know anything about gun safety, you never point a gun to assert authority in a situation. You only point the gun if it is absolutely necessary to protect human life to shoot the gun.
Right.
You don't point the gun willy-nilly, right? And this is one of the big differences, I think, between our military and our police. Our police are overly militarized, but they haven't yet got the discipline down the way the military does. When a SWAT team raids a house because someone's thought they smelled marijuana smoke or something, they've all got their guns out. They're all pointing them at everybody all the time. Right. And it's like, if you're pointing that gun, you ought to follow through and just do what you said you were going to, your body language was in the first place. You better pull the trigger. Because why else are you pointing this at people? You know what I mean? And so, not knowing where a red line is partly trained into us. We're trained to think that you can have a Mexican standoff. Look, if a bunch of guys are all pointing guns at each other, it's going to be over really fast. There's not going to be a conversation.
Right. No. And that's just it, right?
Or if you say, stop right there, and then they rush you, you're going to shoot, because that's the whole point of that situation. Is the composition of that situation is the reason I'm putting my gun is you have to stop now. You start running, you expect to be shot.
Right. And that's just one red line, right? There's been others that I've been forced to think about, which are, I'm in a convenience store and it's getting held up. To be honest,
or a bank or somewhere else.
Or a bank or something like that. To be honest, as I've thought through those, I think that's going to be one of those things where I really hope I'm in tune with the Spirit that day.
Because it's hard to decide where that line is sometimes.
It's hard to decide where that line is because I'm like, is this a desperate man that just needs the money, or is this
or is he going to shoot?
Desperate man who's going to shoot?
Right.
And some of it depends on the weapon that he's using. Is he holding the place up with a knife? Right? At that point,
he's dangerous, but he's probably not going to kill anybody.
Right. So yeah, there's several things. Now, let's put this back in the context of the gospel. Okay?
Yeah, where's my red line?
Where's your red line, Ben? At what point are we going to say, okay, that's enough. You got to stop, right? No more.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to put this down now.
Anytime someone preaches false doctrine relating to blood atonement, anytime somebody preaches false doctrine relating to advocating some kind of blind obedience of authority, anytime somebody is teaching, preaching, or encouraging us to idolize the violence in the scriptures without the context of why it was necessary. If someone's just like, oh man, I wish I could be like Captain Moroni, I'm going to be like, yeah, that's great. I want to be like Captain Moroni too. And because I'm thinking in my head, Captain Moroni was so compassionate to his enemies, so constantly forgiving, so careful, and he valued human life so much, including the lives of his enemies. That's why I respect him so much. But then if I find out the other person in this conversation is like, oh yeah, I really respect him because he knew how to kick butt. I want to be somebody who's ready to kill. I want to toughen up until I'm ready to kill. Then I'm going to be like, whoa, no. So that's that's the type of thing's a red line. Somebody who's misinterpreting or misunderstanding the oath of vengeance, which I believe to be one of the most peaceful and beautiful doctrines of the Restoration.
Explain the oath of vengeance, because not just did Krakauer make reference of it.
Oh yeah, they make a big deal out of that.
But there's been a lot of other authors in terms of Mormon scholarship, and I use that word rather loosely, that tries to describe the oath of vengeance. Tell us what the oath of vengeance is, what it actually is, what it's all about.
The oath of vengeance is a portion of the Mormon Temple Endowment, or at least it was originally. Some people speculate that it might have been added after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. I don't think that's actually true. All of the oath of vengeance language is actually throughout the Bible and the Book of Mormon and a bunch of other places, and definitely was taught by Joseph Smith on many occasions. So I don't think it was made up I think it was probably in the endowment even before Brigham Young, but I can't prove that. No written records, by the way, of what the endowment contained fully. There was no script until 1877. But in 1877, as it was recorded at the time, and as it's still practiced in Christ Church, the oath of vengeance is one of the covenants that we make with God, that we will pray, and that we will never cease to pray and never cease to importune high heaven to avenge the blood of the innocent. And that we will teach this to our children and our children's children to the third and fourth generation. Let me unpack what I believe that means. First of all, I think that it gets a bad rap because of the name. It's been called the Oath of Vengeance. It's really, more accurately, frankly, from its own wording, it should probably be referred to as the Oath of Prayer. But that just sounds too peaceful to people who want to make a big, terrible thing out of this Oath of Vengeance. The prayer of the Oath of Vengeance, of course, is what? That the Lord's will be done, that the Lord's justice come upon those who shed the blood of the innocent. Now, this is throughout the Scriptures. I especially would love to point to the book of Revelation, where John saw in vision the celestial temple. And so he looked up through the heavens, and he saw this representation of heaven with Jesus in the temple that is heaven. And from beneath the altar, significantly, he could hear the blood of the saints crying out for vengeance, the blood of the innocent that had been shed over the ages, crying out to the Lord, "How long, O Lord, until we are avenged?" Now, I want to put this in the context. What was that revelation all about? It wasn't about violence. The scriptural basis of all of this is about prayer, and it's about the holy temple being the place where the innocent cry out for justice from God. It's a prayer, not an act of violence, and it's a prayer for what? It's a prayer for peace. It's a prayer asking God, how long must the innocent suffer in this fallen world? It's wrapped up in the recognition, first of all, that this is a world where these terrible injustices happen. Where Brenda Lafferty and Erica Lafferty, her baby, can be murdered in cold blood. What do you do with such a world? How do we engage with a world filled with war crimes and rape and murder? Now, some people deal with that by saying there must not be a God, because if God was real, he would stop this from happening. But that's not a biblical God, and that's certainly not the way that we understand God in Mormonism. But we do view God as a just God. And we believe that in the end, God will create the millennial age, that he will heal the world and bring about the resurrection. And so the oath of vengeance, to me, is an oath that we will never forget that this is a world of darkness and evil, and that we'll do something about it. And what's the something we're going to do about it? We will pray, and we will never cease praying for an end to all sorrow, an end to that every tear will be dried, and every innocent life that's ever been taken, it's not lost forever. That's because this is what's caught up in the actual hope of the gospel. And this is what John the Revelator, I believe, was teaching about the oath of vengeance in the book of Revelation, is that he was trying to teach us that in spite of this world, there's a better world, that there's a hope. And this is why it's called the gospel of the good news, that there's a hope in that resurrection, that nothing's lost, not forever. Brenda will live again. Erica will live again. Brenda will be able to hold her child to her breast, breathe in the air of a new world, and pick up. The Laffertys cannot rob her of that, right? To me, that's the whole hope of the gospel. And this is one of the reasons why I believe the oath of vengeance is such an important part of the temple ceremony, because it happens right in the very center of the endowment ceremony. And it's described as being this cry from the ground, like a song from the other side of the veil, of all the innocent who have ever died, all the wrongs that have ever been done, every injustice is brought before the Lord. In other words, he's not ignorant of our pain. He's there with us in our pain. And he's promising us, don't be afraid. I will make this right. And so if we can make our heart constantly filled with that prayer, never ceasing to pray for that world, then our heart, our mind becomes attuned with the mind and the will of the divine. That's how I believe we become a peaceful people. That's how we live the gospel of peace, is by having this oath of vengeance, this prayer always in our hearts for God's justice and God's redemption. We don't despair just because we see these terrible things. We know that the evil will get their just reward for their evil, and that the righteous will get the just reward of their righteousness. That there's mercy out there for them, and that it's not the end, And
I won't go into specifics because it's sacred to me, but I will say this. Nowhere in the Oath of Vengeance does it say, do you ever say, make me the instrument, let me be the arm.
Oh, let me do something against the wicked or something. No, that's not in there.
It's always, God, please, your will be done in this. Mm-hmm. Please, Lord, you do this, right? So this is not conditioning.
And this is why it says in the scriptures, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay.
Right.
Because we don't repay.
Right.
The Lord will sort this out. We don't have to do any violence.
Right. And so you're right. I think just because of its name, it gets a bad rap, right?
Right.
The thing I first thought of when I first read it all those years ago, when I first started studying fundamentalism, was this is really like a plea for justice. This isn't a plea for, quote, vengeance. This is justice.
Right, because the Lord's vengeance is justice.
Exactly. And so I think that's very important, because this gets twisted in really heavily along with blood atonement, right?
Right. And so let's talk about blood atonement for a second. I want to get in that too. What is blood atonement? People say again, Krakauer's book, these other things, they want to point out that they believe that the doctrine of blood atonement is this idea that we should kill the evildoers, or that, like jihad or something, like some Mormon version of jihad.
Right.
That those who do really, really evil things, they need to be destroyed. They need to be killed. And that's how we will be saved or something. That's really, if you look at what Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and these other men actually taught, I don't think that's ever the point. It's not about, look, the Mormon pioneers were definitely on the frontier, okay? And there was some frontier justice doled out, but not just by Mormons, okay?
Right.
It was the Wild West, okay? And so I'm not going to try to justify or explain away some of the heinous crimes that were committed. There were heinous crimes committed, okay? But I don't believe that they were properly motivated by a true principle. There is a true principle in blood atonement, and that is really the central message of all Christianity, and actually a huge part of Judaism even now, is the idea that we are saved through the blood. And that sounds really gross and violent because, blood, a bodily fluid or something. But blood is not just a bodily fluid, it's a symbol, in this case, that goes back into ancient antiquity. And the questions that the ancients were asking, these ancient patriarchs were asking about, what about life? What about death? What about after death? What about any of this? And so the blood becomes the symbol of the life within us. This is one of the reasons why nobody accuses us of threatening our family, for example. We would say, hey, it's in your blood, The Incredibles, that's a fun one. In The Incredibles, the parents are these superheroes, right? And they haven't actually trained their kids how to use their powers well. And they're in a dangerous situation. The mom says to Violet, the teenage girl, and so Elastigirl says to, I forget what Violet's superhero name was supposed to be, says to her, don't worry, if the time comes that you have to protect yourself, you'll know what to do. I believe in you because it's in your blood. And Violet then takes the great hope in that, thinking, you know what, it's true. I've never faced a dangerous situation, but it's in my blood. Well, nobody rational, I don't think, would assume that, oh my goodness, the makers, the animators at Pixar must be Mormons. They're teaching blood atonement theology. You know what I mean? And now she's encouraging her to do violence and go kill people because they're crazy Mormons. That, to me, most of the talk about blood atonement and trying to make it into this bad thing would be roughly equivalent to making that connection because of a Pixar movie. Okay, because blood atonement is a doctrine about who we are and how we relate to God, and that we have the opportunity to be redeemed from our mortal state, which is symbolized by the mortal life is in the blood. Okay, so everybody dies, or your children are considered your blood, right? Blood is thicker than water. There's another thing we often say, and nobody thinks we're making violent threats against anyone when we say blood is thicker than water. What we mean, of course, is that we have a connection, and that connection has to do with something fundamental about our lives. So blood being thicker than water is like saying, look, your family is your family, and you got to deal with it, good or bad, right? And so be loyal to your family and help your family. That's all part of these doctrines. And when you isolate it down to one little thing and say, this must mean that you have to kill people, they're really missing the point. The other thing I need to point out is that from Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, a big part of it was a debate about capital punishment. So when they do talk about shedding the blood of murderers and things like that, and let their blood be poured out as an atonement for their sins and things like that, this early Mormon rhetoric wasn't about justifying religious-themed violence, okay? It had almost nothing to do with religion. It had to do with the fact that in the frontier days and in pretty much most of the Christian world, capital punishment was not only common and regularly used worldwide as one of the most important and basic forms of punishment. Okay, so it wasn't this rare thing like it is now. It was a regular occurrence and a public occurrence. They were all doing hanging. And Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and a bunch of other people all pointed out that that is very anti-biblical, to hang people. it talks about how it's terrible dishonor. Anything that's been strangled, even an animal that's been strangled or drowned, is unclean. You can't, like a cow, beef. Beef cattle is absolutely a clean meat. You know what I mean? You can eat beef according to kosher rules. And we do eat beef. Yeah. Okay, you can eat beef according to kosher rules. However, if the cow was strangled or drowned, you cannot. It's like a disrespect against that animal. So why would we be treating even our criminals with such disrespect that would be doing something that's absolutely forbidden in the Bible? And so they were saying, no, it says in the Bible that when a man who sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. This is in the Old Testament. Basically saying, endorsing capital punishment by their reading, and saying, though, it doesn't say hang him, it says shed his blood. And so again, they're pointing to these biblical passages. They're doing so in a symbolic way. They're wrestling with, as we all need to wrestle, with big questions of life and death, not necessarily encouraging violence. There's a quote from Brigham Young. Gets thrown around all the time, and people want to say it's a disgusting, horrible quote. And I think everybody who says that this is terrible has no idea what he's talking about.
Or ever read complete quote.
You've read plenty of quotes. One of the quotes is, I love no wife so well that I would not put a javelin through her heart. And people are like, what are you talking about? First of all, what most people are hearing, the casual reader who doesn't understand the Bible is hearing is, Brigham Young doesn't love his wives, and he doesn't care if he murders them, because he's a callous, he's a callous bastard. Just a murderous bastard. Well, yeah, but if you look at the whole context of his talk and you know what he's referring to, that's not what he's saying at all. He's not talking about actually hurting anybody. He's talking about a story from the Exodus in which there was a javelin put through the heart of two people while they were engaged in intercourse. So this is a very, rated R story. And it was because God was going to destroy the camp of Israel because there was a great evil among them. What was this great evil? It was what's known as temple prostitution. It was a sexualized religious observance of the pagans at the time to have these essentially priestesses that were prostitutes that would do these sexual rituals. And God said, I will not have my people doing like them. You have to put a stop to this. And if you don't, I will destroy Israel. Okay, so first of all, don't forget, God is in this conversation, and it's still probably symbolic. It might not even be literal. Again, people take the scriptures way too literally, way too often. Okay, but what we have here is like a parable. We have a parable where God says, if you don't stop this, there will be consequences, and then someone stops this thing. So what was Brigham Young saying? He wasn't saying he doesn't love his wives, and he wasn't saying he's going to murder anybody. He was saying, get your priorities straight. Do not excuse evil. Well, I think that's the same thing I'm saying when we need to stand up against violent rhetoric.
I was just thinking here for a second. It's amazing to me that we have to tell, quote, scholars, not to take the scriptures
to recognize at least when someone's making a biblical reference.
Making a biblical reference, right? I find that kind of funny. So, yeah, and I think it's also important to point out that, as far as I can tell, as far as it being church sanctioned, I know of one instance down in Sanpete County. You probably are more well read than I am.
Are you talking about religious justifications for violence?
Right. Blood atonement, with blood atonement, right?
Okay.
One instance in Sanpete County. I'm not sure if Mountain Meadows would even come close to meeting that criteria.
The main reason Mountain Meadows sort of does is that they executed John D. Lee.
Right.
By the firing squad. And one of the reasons they executed him by the firing squad was specifically because of these teachings about not hanging him.
Right.
And now, of course, he would have been hung in any other court. But instead, they shot him because of the idea that execution should be carried out in a biblical manner.
Right. Yeah. When Brigham talks about it, and if you read context, it seems to be Brigham's talking much more about a government than a religious right.
Oh,
so
yeah, I
right? Does that make sense? Am I off base?
Oh, yeah, no, that's the way I interpret it, too. I think that, look,
but you have to get the context.
You have to get the context. The governor of the territory is in charge of the executive function. That means if anyone is convicted of a capital crime during his time period, seeing them duly executed was the duty of the executive branch, which was basically Brigham Young. So Brigham Young expressing his political views on a political subject of which he is literally the legal officer is a perfectly reasonable thing to expect him to do.
Absolutely. Especially, look, you can't take a whole colony of religious-minded folks and expect that religion's not going to bleed over. It bled over into our Constitution in the United States, right? So it just happens to be what some would consider a fringe religion, right?
Right.
And so again, I think it's more it's more ominous sounding in the in its name than it is in practice. That it ever was in practice. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. Now, there have been other situations of violence. There's the Morrisite War. There's Mountain Meadows. Porter Rockwell almost certainly shot quite a few people. There's a couple of other really ugly ones that happened. They're, and those are all sad instances, but they're not necessarily. And some of them were more political than others, and some of them were religious. But here's my point. I don't think we have to have a clean history in order to stand up for a better future.
No, I don't think so either.
And so, yeah, we have some examples where people twisted religious doctrines and used them as excuses to do evil. First of all, I think I can't excuse a lot of statements as not being what they're made out to be in Under the Banner of Heaven, for example. But even if I couldn't, we can still do better. We can still absolutely do better than what we've been doing in the past. And, the most recent example is got to be Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow.
Right.
They're not even on trial yet, but they're working up to it. So sometime this summer or fall, they're going to be having their murder trial, and they're yet another religious serial killers, right? They murdered Lori Vallow's children. They murdered Chad Daybell's wife. They murdered somebody's brother. I don't remember whose brother. If it was Lori's brother, Chad's brother,
right.
And probably a couple of other people. And of course, especially disturbing is them murdering Lori's children.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's just absolutely no excuse for any of that. And when you had, at a certain point, Chad Daybell looked like this upright, good Mormon man who's eloquent and is an author and all this sort of thing, everybody was like, oh yeah, he's one of us. He's one of us. Now everyone's quick to be like, oh no, he's not a real Mormon. He believed in weird doctrines. Well, yeah, he did believe in weird doctrines, but where did he get his start? He got his start in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He just started twisting those doctrines. He started turning it into something weird.
Right.
And when it starts looking violent, that's when it was everybody in his ward's job, everybody at the conferences he spoke at, everybody in any of those groups, before it turned to murder, should have started telling him, no, this could be used to justify violence. You can't mean it that way. You must mean it some other way because that's not what we believe. And just standing up to him. And then he wouldn't have gone so far. His doctrines are admittedly super weird and not super orthodox. They're not what I would say is my beliefs or anybody's beliefs that I know.
I don't think he, and I could be wrong.
But they have a Mormon root, I guess is my
right.
point. He's got some basis in Mormonism. Even though his beliefs turned into like zombie apocalypse, reincarnation, crazy stuff that I don't believe, at its heart, it's still fundamentally Mormon in nature. And that's where it came from originally. That's where he got his start. So how did he get from point A to point B? He had to travel there somehow before he got into like, let's murder people. He had to start with the same first four principles and ordinances of the gospel I did. He had to start with the same Sunday school lessons I did. He had to start with the same primary songs that I did. At what point did he diverge from the path of peace and go into the path of murder? Whenever we see somebody's on that path, we don't have to wait for them to get to the end before we say, no. Get back on the path of peace. Get off the path that leads to justifying this kind of violence. And I don't know if that would have stopped him, but I think that the consciences of a lot of people who knew him would be a lot clearer right now if they'd stood up. And maybe they could have stopped him. Or maybe at least they could have stopped him sooner. And so fewer people could have died.
I think we talked a lot about the othering, right, of people. And I feel like within Mormonism, it's super easy to do. Because the very, I shouldn't say the sole basis, but one of the big pillars was God's chosen people. You're going back to build it. So as I've looked at that, and I've thought a lot about it over the last week, how do we prevent that othering while we still hold that place of, okay, we have a special responsibility? I think we have to let go the ego.
We really do, because otherwise, if you're, I'm one of God's chosen people, the kind of pride that breeds, the kind of hubris that breeds, because, God will justify his prophet. That's one of the sayings I should have brought up earlier. Really ticks me off. That one is one of the most dangerous false doctrines. Anybody quoting that unironically, call them out. That's a red line. When they start saying, God will justify his prophet. No, he won't. God expects us to step up and stop these self-proclaimed prophets before they commit violence.
Right. And so I thought, what does letting go the ego look like in a practical sense for someone who believes in this chosen people theology?
Sure, right?
And as I thought about that, I got to, it looks like servant leadership. It doesn't look like self-aggrandizement. It doesn't look like, look at me because I'm special. You've got to recognize I'm special. It looks like, let me wash your feet.
Right.
Let me serve you. Let me feed you. Let me clothe you. That, I think, is the chosen that the Lord speaks of.
One of the best examples of this in modern society that I think we could definitely learn from is Orthodox Jews. Like the Chabad organization. They are a group of Orthodox Jews who understand themselves to be chosen people. And because they're Orthodox in their beliefs, they take their religion very, very seriously. They enact that religion in the world. Could they use passages from the Torah or the prophets to justify violence? Well, yeah, we've seen people do that when they misinterpret them, according to our understanding, right? But they don't. Instead, they interpret it to mean that they have a duty to heal the world, to do good, right? And so that's the thing. When there's two possible interpretations, if you're choosing the one that justifies violence instead of the one that promotes peace, you're interpreting it wrong, right? And so, they have the same Torah we do. They have it in there as in the book of Joshua and in Samuel about utterly destroying their enemies and things like that. But look at the way they're enacting those scriptures in the world. Chabad teaches peace, and they promote peace, and they want to see, and this is especially important because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We need more Israelis willing to stand up for, no, we have to choose peace, even in the face of violence. Because that's the only way you really resolve these intransient conflicts, these horrible conflicts. And so almost any Jew will always stand up for any race, any religion, anyone who's being persecuted. They'll be some of the first to stand up and say no. You know what I mean? These might not be our people, but these are our people because you don't get to persecute anybody. They'll call you out. Even while they maintain their own distinct identity and religion and practice, they don't have to just lose their virtues or their principles in order to defend the rights of others. I think we can do the same thing. Essentially, like you were saying earlier, LGBTQ communities. We need to recognize that those communities and their rights are fundamental to their dignity as human beings. And we have to be ready to protect them in those rights. No matter what we think of their religion or their lifestyle, that's their right to choose that religion, to choose that lifestyle, to choose that way of being. We have to defend them because they also need to defend us.
That's right. You don't, and this is the part that gets conflated, right? Mm-hmm. You don't have to give your seal of approval on their lifestyle. You have to be willing to defend their right to live it, even if you think that it's not ideal, or that it's the wrong way to live. Or maybe, You have to defend that right. Because I remember I got the opportunity once to have in-depth talks with an old stake patriarch who was way wise. And this was when I was first coming into the church. He said, "Do you know the one place God will never intervene?" I'm like, "Where?" Your will.
Right.
That's the only thing.
God will never interfere with your will. If you desire...
Right. So if it's so important that God's not willing to get involved, what makes you think that we're qualified?
Well, and this is one of the unique ways in which, and this is worthy of a whole lot of discussion, one of the ways in which Mormonism attempts to solve the problem or the question of evil is that we do believe in a non-interventionist God, but not necessarily as far as the deists do. We believe that God can intervene, but that he acts through ordinances, through priesthood.
Right.
He reveals his will that way and so forth. But that's different than saying that that God just interferes, right? He's not going to stop a murderer. Instead, he's going to raise the person who's killed from the dead. He's going to make it right in his own way in the world to come, but that's different than assuming that God should always intervene. And so, that's one of the ways that we attempt to solve that problem. How does evil exist? Why does it exist? Because if that's what someone chooses, God will not interfere.
Right. All right. So we've covered a lot. But I want to bring it back to one thing, and this is where I kind of want to wrap up. This is the last idea I want to explore, unless you got others that you feel are important. Because I think this is the thing that has been weighing on my heart the most all week, and especially at 3 a.m. last night after I got done watching the 2 episodes. And I know somewhere there's an LDS person. There's a Mormon person. There is somebody who's maybe struggling with their faith anyway. And they just got a big dose of the Laffertys.
Oh, I know, right? That's such a traumatic thing.
So let's make up a hypothetical. You encounter someone who's like, I don't think I can believe in Mormonism anymore, Ben. I don't think I can do this any longer because look at this. This is just horrific. What do you say to that person?
These are tough ones, right? First of all, because my reasons for faith are my own. They're in my heart. They're in my experience. You really can't communicate a testimony to another person fully. You can talk about your own belief or your own experience, but people have to experience for themselves. And I don't know what they actually need. Where's their problem coming from? Their real question might be coming from a place of they want to not believe. Maybe there's a burden in their life that religion looks like it's a burden to carry and it's not benefiting them. Sometimes people feel like religion stifles their freedom instead of gives them more freedom or more insight, or that it's myopic instead of enlightening. Well, I want them to be able to let go of that kind of religion. I guess what I'm trying to say is that when someone comes to me with big questions like that, I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing, because I think faith is found in a faith crisis. I believe that, and actually, very eloquently, though I don't think he's the originator of the idea, Andrew Garfield, during the Q&A session after the premiere, Andrew Garfield, who plays Jeb Pyrie, said, and he'll be quoted for this a lot because it was really good. He said, "I don't know that a life of certainty is a life of faith. A life of doubt is a life of faith." Something to that effect, that faith is to be found in your doubts. And so when I see somebody who's questioning their faith seriously because they see, maybe for the first time, the real darkness that exists in this world and in our communities, because this is our community we're talking about. Sometimes people, because they want to other it, they might say, well, if that's what this community stands for, then I'm leaving. I'm out. Because I need to maintain an us versus them, where I protect my own mind, saying I'm good guy. I'm one of the good guys, and they're the bad guys. And so this is one of the traps that a lot of ex-Mormons fall into. They assume that because they found evil in their old community, that if they leave that community, all evil, all bad things can be Mormon, and all good things can be whatever their future is. And then, of course, not knowing where their moral boundaries are, some of them struggle quite a bit. Once they've lost their faith, because they no longer have a mooring, a foundation upon which they build their worldview. It's very disorienting. But I don't think that the disorientation in that first point is the bad thing. I think it's the big question is, how do we deal with it? And so I think when somebody views something like Under the Banner of Heaven and they say, I'm losing my faith because of this, I'm beginning to see Mormonism in a totally new light. It now looks to me like Joseph Smith's a con man, and Mormonism is dangerous, false doctrine, that it's selfish by nature, that it leads to murder. You know, all of the Krakauer's whole thesis, essentially. I would first really try to warn them to recognize that darkness, that evil that you're recognizing, it's real, but you can't just dismiss it that easily. You can't dismiss it as easily as just being like, oh, it's a problem with religion, or it's a problem with Mormonism. Otherwise, you don't learn the lesson, you don't mature past it. In order to mature spiritually, you have to sit in your doubt and embrace the darkness itself, see that darkness. I know that I cannot remember who it is, but I know it came from somebody in the 70s or 80s in the LDS Church. He talks a little bit about how in our doubts, we reach the point in the darkness where we cannot see the next step. But if we will step forward in faith, we will see that the way is lighted ahead just a step or two. This was a powerful analogy to me. It's also an analogy made by Yogi Ramachakra, who turns out was actually one of the teachers of the Theosophical Society about 100 and some years ago.
I know who they are. Yeah.
Do you know who that is?
Yeah.
Anyway, but I appreciated it because he brought in the idea that faith is jumping into the darkness, knowing where you'll land. And he used the example of the hymn, Lead Kindly Light, which says, I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step's enough for me. And so if you picture that hymn, I imagine it being much like the vision of Lehi. You're lost in the midst of darkness. You know that somewhere far away lies the sacred rest. Somewhere out there is a better world. Somewhere out there is goodness and truth. But right now, all I see is the dark. If I could just have a little light to take one step in the right direction, then you find that you can progress. And so in the Mormon view, from the Lehi's dream, for example, Lehi found himself lost, terribly lost in the darkness. And at first he tried to follow a man, but the man couldn't lead him. He was still lost in the darkness. And then he prayed to God, God, help me. And that's when he saw a light. And it turned out the light was the tree. And he saw also the other people in the dream were lost in the darkness, but if they could bump into this rod of iron, if they could bump into this handrail, even though they couldn't see, they were like, wait, there's a rail here. What's this railing? And they would fall, and they would literally, it says hand over hand the rod, right? In other words, just holding on one little bit at a time, it would lead them out of the dark. Basically what happens with doubt, with any of these faith crises, is that they may have been lost in the dark this whole time, but they just didn't know it. They weren't aware of their awful situation. Mm-hmm. And something like Under the Banner of Heaven or these other things can make us awaken to very serious issues we've never struggled with before. How do I know if Joseph Smith was a Jew prophet? Do I believe this because I was taught it in primary? I don't even know anything about Joseph Smith, frankly, if all I know is the church curriculum. Joseph Smith lived a complex and powerful and interesting life, but the correlated version I could tell you in just a few sentences. Boy asked God which church to join. He saw Heavenly Father and Jesus Christ. Moroni appeared. He translated the Book of Mormon, and then he was super awesome until the bad guys killed him. That's basically all you're going to learn, right? But it doesn't make me believe in Joseph Smith less to know the complexities and the interestingness of his life. It makes me believe in him more, because I see through him and his struggle both the humanity and the divinity of what the human condition is. But how did I arrive there? I only arrived there through the darkness of trying to struggle with those things. So what am I trying to say? One thing I would point people to, if they don't want to accept religious authority, maybe they're like, well, yeah, but Benjamin's a believer. I don't want to listen to Benjamin. I would say, think about some of the Jungian psychology, maybe. Jungian archetypes. Incorporating the shadow. If you want to actually understand the human condition and what causes these evils to exist and what's really going on, you have to embrace that it's not that you can't just separate yourself from it by saying, oh, that bad stuff was in Mormonism. Now I'm an ex-Mormon and now I'm free from that. No, I'm sorry, the darkness is still there because it was in you all along.
Right.
And this is why a good man is not necessarily a weak man. He's a man who has it under control. I would say a real adult isn't a person who's rejected the darkness. It's a person who's recognized the darkness within, their own capability for evil, and then they've chosen not to do it. So, for example, I do not think of a pacifist being a pacifist, philosophically. A pacifist is not a man who doesn't like violence and therefore just tries to avoid it. A pacifist is a man who fully understands and embraces violence enough to choose to stand between the violent and the innocent. A real pacifist is someone like Gandhi, who was willing to say, I will make my own body the sacrifice. One of the most powerful moments, it's in the film, of course, of Gandhi, and it's just a powerful moment in his biography, was when he's in South Africa, and they wanted to make all of the Indians register with these cards and things like that, and they were doing a protest where they were going to take the cards one by one, read the names, and burn them. And at that time, connected to Britain, right, these police show up and they're like, it's a crime to burn it's not a draft card, but that's the one thing we did in our country that was similar. It's not, it's just a registration card. You can't burn them. It belongs to us. We're breaking up this protest. You have to go home. And he just ignored them. And he read the name and he burned it right in front of him. And they were like, no, we got to stop him. So they went and one of the guys hits him with a billy club. And he picks up the next one and he reads it. And he burns it. And the guy hits him again until they knock him on the ground. And they're like, are you going to give up and disperse now? And he's like, no. And he crawls while they're beating him back to the pile, reads the name, crawls back to the fire, burns it again. Right? So, what's my point? My point is, Gandhi, for example, who's one of our great prophets of pacifism, he wasn't a man unfamiliar with violence.
Right.
He was a man who simply decided his reaction to violence would be through this radical act of self-sacrifice. So what's my point? My point is that when someone comes to me and says they're losing their faith, I would point out to them a few things. First, you're not losing your faith. You might be gaining faith for the first time in your life. Before this, what you called faith may have only been belief, may have only been default. You were raised this way. You were taught. It could just be programming.
Your default operating system.
Your default operating system. It could just be your programming. But now that you're questioning, now you have the opportunity to have real faith. Like Andrew Garfield was saying, a life of faith is a life of doubt. It's a life where you don't dismiss the darkness, you confront it.
Right.
And the other thing I would point out to them is many, many prophets and sages from all religions throughout all time, they came through this darkness. So don't think that it's hopeless. You too can go through this into a life of much greater insight, capacity, and faith. But again, they're going to have to walk that path themselves. They're going to have to experience it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm always a little bit reluctant to tell someone what they should believe, because they're going to have to find it. Now, if they say, well, what about this question or what about that question? I can point them to the answers that the ancients and the modern prophets and the gurus and the whatnot of various religions have answered those questions. But again, none of it's real until they go through their own dark night of the soul and find it for themselves.
Last one, the other archetyped, right? Mm-hmm. Raised in Utah County.
Okay.
Been to BYU. Is the first counselor in his elders quorum president. Okay. Has been well correlated
Okay, yes.
isn't necessarily in a faith crisis, but just got smacked in the face.
With all kinds of things that they are like, that can't be true. I've never heard of this.
Right. So they're not in a full-blown faith crisis. Where would you point them for resources where they can begin to read this, right? Or talk to other people? Because this is going to be huge, right? As these questions start coming up, and I'll just go back.
This is tricky. Like, because if I point them to Richard Bushman and rough sword rolling and things like that, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say, don't point him there. There's all kinds of stuff in there that is uncorroborated and could be destructive of faith. And yet, I think, man, you got to be enough of an adult to deal with and sort through that yourself. Because I mean, I don't think Richard Bushman was right about everything either. For example,
no.
But you have to be able to read about both sides of the argument in order to really
exactly. So
find the truth in the middle.
And that's the conundrum I faced when I was thinking about this last night. Like, I feel like in some ways I almost need to get like a preferred reading list for people who just got smacked in the face.
That is a great idea. That is a great idea.
Okay, here, you want to know about blood atonement? Go read this. Here it is. Here's a link. Here's where you can find it. Something. Because here's the thing. There's a ton of people. I don't know how I know this, but I know this. There are a ton of people that just felt like they just got punched in the face by Mike Tyson, and now they're trying to regain their legs.
Regain their composure, and they just don't even know where to start.
And they're panicked, and they're like, oh, crap, what's going on?
Right, and the other thing, too, is it's easy enough for me to take for granted things that I know that other people don't. So, like, for example, like when you're like School of Prophets, wasn't that Harmston's group? And it's like, actually, that's called the True and Living Church.
Right.
And this one was called the School of the Prophets.
Right.
And it's like, actually two different things. You know, one of the biggest problems with Krakauer's book is he generalizes everything so much.
Right.
One of the best things that I do want you to put the link on, that's on the reading list for sure, that I want everyone to think about, is something written by Shirley Draper. She talked about how that no one in her entire community, she lived in Colorado City, she was FLDS. She said, no one in my entire community had ever so much as heard the name Lafferty. They had no connection with anyone in our entire community. But the book Under the Banner of Heaven severely affected my community. And it put us in danger. And she said it affected my own life. It put my mother's life in danger. It made it very difficult for me to leave the FLDS because everybody just knew. You know, it was common knowledge, even though it was incorrect. It was just prejudice. But it was common knowledge that the FLDS were connected with those Laffertys who killed those people. They weren't. They were connected to this other group. They had no communication whatsoever, as far as I know, with any FLDS person. But Krakauer lumped them all together in the book, and it created huge amounts of fallout for the culture. The exact same thing is going to be happening to these poor guys that are going to be blindsided. It's going to be happening to the mainstream LDS. They're going to be, people are going to watch it, and they're going to be like, well, yeah, apparently LDS people are just like the Laffertys. The Laffertys are an example of what all Mormons are like, right?
When you strip away, right? I can just see the argument.
And so that prejudice is going to be there.
Yeah.
And so what do you do about it? And I think that one of the main things that we need to do first is we need to recognize there's nuance here that you don't know. For example, like I was saying earlier, the difference between the FLDS, the AUB, the True and Living Church, the School of the Prophets, any of these other groups, they're different people. We can't lump them all together. We shouldn't be generalizing, and because that'd just be prejudice. It'd be like saying that because one person of one race committed one crime, that they're all a bunch of criminals, or that anti-Semitic things, or any of these other prejudices. It's the same thing, and there's real prejudice against Mormon fundamentalists, even more than there is against mainstream Mormons, and even mainstream Mormons are going to be feeling it from this show. So I guess what I would say is take a deep breath. Don't other anybody involved. Take a deep breath and just allow nuance and learning to happen. You can say, look, I don't know about those people, and that's not my experience with my church. As a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that does not look representative to me of my community. And go ahead and just say it that simply to people who bring it to your attention. Or people who are looking for answers, might stumble on this podcast. They're going to be like, well, what do I do with all these people who want to know if I made murder covenants or something in strange Mormon temples? You can say, that is not my experience with my religion. And be comfortable with maybe you don't know. It's okay. There are complicated and nuanced answers if you want them to be correct answers. And right now, generalizations, hasty and horrible, prejudicial generalizations are about to be made willy-nilly all over the place. Be the rational one who stands up and says, that's not my experience. That's not my understanding. I'm sure the truth is out there, even though I don't know what it is. And I think it's okay for us to say we don't know what it is. But I know that if you're making a hasty generalization, that you're the one who's wrong. So let's all be mature about this and learn these things one at a time, one little bit at a time. But I really wish the best thing I can say for a reading list is Shirley Draper's article is a must when considering how these things affect your community, because all of us are about to be experiencing some of that. And she had some great insight about what it meant to her for other people to generalize against her, to use prejudice against her. And she's a great example of resilience and strength in the face of that. Calmly and consistently being bold enough to say, well, actually, that's not quite correct. Let's look at the nuance of the issue. This is my experience. Let me explain to you. Right? And so, yeah, I would say the blindsided, poor, average Mormon guy or gal who doesn't know anything about this is going to have to say, I don't know about that.
Right. Maybe you and I will get together after this podcast.
Maybe we'll put together a reading list, right?
Maybe we'll get something together to where we can put our heads together and just give some resources. Because, look,
I wish there were better resources out there, because frankly, one of the biggest problems of Mormon fundamentalism is because of our justified fear of authorities. There's been a lot of persecution. We just don't speak out. We don't speak out enough. And because we don't speak up, other people speak for us. And those people are often inaccurate and filled with prejudice or some ulterior motive. And yeah, if we don't speak up, then there is no other side to the coin. There is no other story. And frankly, I do not think there really are a lot of good materials in print that explain a lot of this history. Because a lot of it's never been written well.
Well, and here's the other thing. Because, and I'm trying to say this without being accusatory here, but because the LDS Church has tried to disavow some of this and just flat suppress it, let's be honest, right? Let's call it what it is. Yeah.
A spade's a spade.
Right. Because of that, they find their membership now maybe a little ill-equipped to deal with what's coming.
Absolutely. And they're also not trained to take their own personal moral responsibility and say, I will take responsibility for my own spiritual life and my community and say, this is my experience and this is not my experience. They don't feel equipped. They feel like they have to defer to authority again, some correlated material that's going to have all the answers.
Right.
In this case, that's probably the scariest realization that they're going to have to just live with. I'm sorry. There is no correlated answer to this.
Right.
There is no pat answer. There's not going to be a simple right and wrong answer. There's going to be a whole lot of answers that are going to have multiple different viewpoints, and you're going to have to wrestle with all of them.
Right. And I wasn't saying that to beat up on the LDS Church. I really wasn't.
Yeah, no, but it is true, though, that is something I struggle with.
I want my LDS brothers and sisters to be able to stand firm. Yeah. I really do. I'm concerned for them. And so that was why I felt like this podcast was so vital. So,
as a believer in the prophetic calling of Joseph Smith and a believer in the restoration, as someone who loves the Book of Mormon and all of that, I think probably one of my greatest sorrows is that when confronted with very difficult questions in anti-Mormon literature or wherever else they might find it, that so many choose to abandon faith altogether.
Right.
As a man who believes in God and believes that when we pray, we do not pray in vain. I do believe that there is a God who hears our prayers. It breaks my heart that 99 out of 100 people, when confronted with these big problems, throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. And that's what I don't want to see. I just don't.
If they were coming to the Community of Christ or Christ Church or the AUB or something, 99 out of 100 times when they see the corruptions and the failings in the mainstream LDS Church, if they were going somewhere else where they could find more, where they could find better answers, where they could be free to examine and struggle, then I wouldn't be so sad. But so few actually keep their faith. Right. It reminds me of, and it broke my heart. I should be better with pop culture than I am, but what's the name of the guy in Imagine Dragons who's one of the main singers?
Dan Reynolds?
Yes. Yes, Dan Reynolds. He did a music video of the song Believer, which he wrote. Mm-hmm. And in that music video, he is so angry because of the way the church has had the November 5th policy, mm-hmm. Right? Basically saying that even the children of a gay parent had no ecclesiastical rights in the church, that everyone was to be shunned. The whole family was to be shunned completely out of the church. It was shocking kind of behavior, honestly, from any religious institution to blame children for their parents' sexual orientation or something. It was bizarre. But anyways, he was so mad about that he wrote that song about his own pain and religious struggle and feeling like he was finally just done with the church. And so, once again, he went from the in-group to the out-group. So, when he was in the in-group, people held him up like, we've got celebrities that are Mormons. Dan Reynolds is so great. You know what I mean? And he's a Mormon. You know, and then he writes this song, and pretty soon it was like, well, he's not representative of Mormons. He's just a gay weirdo who does music, and we don't like him, and blah, blah, blah. And they just push him right out. So, that's why they did the Love Loud concerts here and stuff like that. To defend people, frankly, who feel cast out of the LDS community for being LGBTQ or something. Anyways, my point is that when he made this music video, it shows him really angry, and there are these against these photographs that are distorted photographs, and he even spray paints on one of them, and they're pictures of Jesus and Joseph Smith.
Oh, jeez.
And I'm like, look, I understand that he's going through religious anguish. And I really felt for Dan Reynolds. The thing that broke my heart is he should have been spray painting a photo of Thomas S. Monson and Russell M. Nelson. These are the guys responsible for this. These are the guys who made that choice. Russell M. Nelson was out telling everyone, this is a pure revelation from God. We should never have anything to do with LGBTQ people. Their children should be blamed for their parents. This is what the Lord's will is. You know, Russell M. Nelson's out doing that. Monson, who knows what his capacity was at the time, but he certainly seemed to have signed off on it, at least in some capacity, since he was president of the church at the time. Why isn't Dan Reynolds throwing his anger at the men who made this decision instead of throwing his anger at God? But I think that this is exactly the problem that we have in Mormonism, a really deep problem we have in Mormonism, which is that we don't know the difference between follow the prophet and follow the Lord. We don't know the difference between choose the right and do what you're told. We don't seem to know the difference between God. I know the gospel is true, and I know the church is true. Those are different things. They're very, very different things.
Sure they are. Yep.
And I think that it takes a certain amount of faith crisis and struggle before people learn that, because we are not taught that in the correlated curriculum. Right. We're taught that obedience is the same thing as righteousness. We're taught that, that following the prophet is the same thing as following God. But the Laffertys, for example, are an excellent case in point why that is not true. They said, oh, we've got a revelation. We have to murder people because of our revelation. And so, in that deluded state, if you're in the follow the prophet crowd, and that's what the prophet's telling you, you have to, then you're going to go along. And this is why we have to decide ahead of time that we're not going to go along. We have to decide ahead of time that there are lines that we won't cross. I think this is one of the things that, and Mormons aren't good at that. I talk to people all the time who say, oh, don't worry, it'll never happen. The prophet will never lead us astray. But that's such dangerous rhetoric, especially after seeing the Laffertys and Warren Jeffs and plenty of so-called prophets who definitely led people astray. And don't forget, there were people in the FLDS who were like, well, of course I don't believe the prophet could never lead us astray, because I know that the mainstream LDS church prophets have led people astray. But Warren, Uncle Warren, would never lead us astray.
It's different.
It's different this time. It's my church. It's my people. This is the in-group. My in-group is the good guys. So it won't happen here. That is immature and it's wrong. We have to step up and say, it doesn't matter where it is. I have a prophet. I have file leaders. There's temple presidencies. There's quorum presidents. I sustain the leaders in my church. But I don't sustain them blindly, as in I'm going to do something bad if they tell me to. I sustain them because they give me insight that leads me to the divine. that revelation that leads to the divine. But if they come out and they show me a revelation, they say, look, here's a revelation from God, and it clearly leads into the darkness, I need to have the courage to say, no. Yep. No, I don't care that you're the prophet. No. And so I think that this is the type of thing I wish I could go into like every primary in the whole church and just blow their minds a little bit. We should be doing moral agency exercises. We should be exercising our moral agency by saying every time we receive an instruction from anyone, we should be saying, should I follow this or should I not? Is this a lawful order in military parlance or is this an unlawful order? When we do that, then we recognize that there's a big difference between following the prophet or following God, or following or knowing that the church is true or knowing that the gospel is true. And then we might hold them accountable so that the next time, I mean, like, for example, for me, the reason I was out of the mainstream LDS church was because of changes to the doctrines, changes to the temple ordinances, changes to the priesthood, that I was like, no, you don't have the authority to do that. Right. But there's plenty of things that people who are perfectly fine with that. I know lots of good LDS people in the mainstream LDS church who fully believe that Russell M. Nelson has not crossed the line. I would still ask them to draw a line. Because all of us need to for our own moral health. We need to say, okay, maybe I don't think that we're over the line yet. Maybe the LDS church is not an apostasy, or Christ Church. I don't believe Christ Church is, like, at least not fully an apostasy. We're still doing pretty good, but the difference is I do have a line where I will know if they cross that line, it's too far. That red line, and I just wish that every Mormon would take a moment to draw that line. You might think it's ludicrous. You might think, well, Russell M. Nelson or Donald H. Oakes or none of these guys, they're never going to get up there and cross that line. Doesn't mean it isn't useful to have that line.
Right.
You got to have that line so that you can...
Maybe it's not Russell M. Nelson. Maybe it's not Donald H. Oakes. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's the next guy. Maybe it's the guy after that. Maybe it's some guy you don't even see on your radar.
And maybe it's even just a test. You know, I remember, here's one that I actually experienced in the LDS church that taught this principle. He really upset people. I don't think he gave this talk more than once. We had a high councilman come to our ward to give a talk. And his point was we shouldn't have blind obedience. So this was really fun. He got up and he said, well, I've been sent by the stake presidency, and it is proposed that we sustain, and he went through the regular stuff, and then he started adding weird stuff and seeing when people would stop. And it got super weird. It is proposed that on Thursday afternoons we eat nothing but cheddar cheese, and that any food besides cheddar cheese that is eaten between the hours of 12 noon and 6 p.m. on a Thursday is a violation of the word of wisdom, and that we will surrender our temple recommends. All in favor? Any opposed? You know, and it was just like, it got sillier and sillier, but it was silly as crap for 10 minutes before people stopped. And he said, and there were people, and probably a good half of the congregation continued to sustain all the way to the end until he just gave up. And he said, I'm making a point here. There's two ways you can look at what we just did. One, those of you who stopped, you know, congratulations to you guys, because you recognized that there are limits and that this was not appropriate. And here's the problem. He was also in favor of the people who continued. And those of you who went all the way to the end, bravo for you, because you are willing to be obedient no matter what. But I was one of those who at least used this example as a moment to realize, wait a second, but I shouldn't be obedient no matter what.
Right.
There are limits. Maybe we shouldn't be sustaining insanity or violence or just craziness. And that's why I'm saying everybody should make a line in their head. I've heard people say, for example, look, the LDS Church is probably going to ordain women to the priesthood. The LDS Church is probably going to have gay temple marriage. The LDS Church is likely to do a bunch of those types of things in the very near future, I think, fairly near future at least, because that's what's going to become politically necessary, or at least probably going to become politically necessary.
Right.
And they won't do it unless it is necessary, but I think that it's possible that will be necessary for them to retain their tax status or something else. If that does happen, I bet you they'll cave. I mean, for goodness sakes, Jimmy Carter even said he didn't directly threaten the tax status. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that Bob Jones University case didn't go to the Supreme Court the next year.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Anyway, but my point is that we need to draw that line. If that's over the line for you, decide right now that's over the line for you, so that if it does happen, or when it does happen, you will have the moral courage to stand up and say, I am opposed. And if you can't do that, you don't have your moral agency intact, really. In which case, you're not going to stand up against the Laffertys.
No.
You're going to ride in the backseat of that car, and they're going to drive you to hell with blood on their hands.
Yeah, you're 100% correct. And that's why I kept coming back to that whole red line thing, right? Where's your red line, and where's it at? All right, fellas, we've done 2 hours and 50 minutes.
Oh, my gosh. That's so long.
So I want to end with giving you guys each something to say. Felipe, I'm going to start with you. I'll go, and then Ben, I'm going to give you the last
You
word.
barely got a chance. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
It's all good. I'm still a student learning this stuff. Like, I've never read The Banner of Heaven. My older sister did when she was investigating the LDS Church, and that prevented her from... That was one of the books that's just turned her off from it. And when I heard they were making a series, I rolled my eyes. I was like, oh, this is going to suck. And I don't think Latter-day Saints should be afraid to investigate history. They shouldn't be afraid. You're gonna find ugly things, but it's normal. I mean, I used to be Catholic. Imagine how I felt when I read the Catholic Church did that, you know? But it didn't cause me to view the Catholic Church in a negative way, but don't be afraid to investigate your own history. It's history. It's going to be dark sometimes. It's not all sugar-coated. It's not a walk in the field. Joseph Smith is still a prophet of God. Brigham Young is still a prophet of God. And the more you know, I think you'll be able to defend, at least in a good conscience, know that you did your best to defend Mormon history, to defend the prophets for yourself and for those who may have a question, because it may just be a simple question. You could save somebody from, not save, but you could probably motivate them, inspire them not to turn away from God, you know. But
oh, that's good.
It's neat to hear too about after all, you've had this struggle.
yeah.
You had to go, wait a second, is the Catholic Church the authority or not? And learn about the Restoration.
Right. More than anything else, I thought about what I was going to say in this last segment. More than anything else, I guess I just want to bear testimony to the fact that if you don't give up on God, He doesn't give up on you. He doesn't give up on you when you do give up on Him.
Right.
But stick this out. I know right now, for some, this is a scary moment. You're reeling, your feet are wobbly. You got punched in the face. And it was a great quote, I believe by Muhammad Ali, I could be wrong, which is everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yep.
And so you may have had everything all mapped out, and now you've got punched in the face. Stick it out. Get to the next round. Sit down. Breathe. Drink some water. That's an allegory for breathe. Read a little bit more. Read context. Learn the history, because history has a huge bearing on context. Learn those things. And then reach out if you can't get the answer on your own. Reach out to me. I'm not going to guarantee that I can give you that answer, but I can certainly put you in touch with others that can. That's the whole reason I have people on here that are way smarter than me, because I want this to be of worth, but reach out to folks. And I know it seems scary. I've been in your shoes. It's a big leap going from fundamentalism, thought processes to reaching out to an actual fundamentalist. But please, we're here for you. Even if you never join the church we go to. Absolutely. And stay in the LDS church. And above all, know that this gospel is true. Joseph Smith was a true prophet. Brigham Young was a true prophet. And I leave that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Ben?
There's courage and strength in each one of us that I think that we don't realize, because most of us have had very few opportunities to truly tap into it. I think what I would like to leave us with is be bold. Be bolder than you think you need to be. Be stronger than you think you need to be, and it'll work. Because that strength is in you. Learn from my mistake with my brother in not being bold enough. It doesn't matter if you've been taught that snitches get stitches. When someone's headed in a dangerous path, it's an act of love and self-sacrifice to stand up and speak out, even if you have to call the police or CPS. And it doesn't matter even if there's going to be consequences to you. You can handle them because you're stronger than you know. One of my favorite books by Ogden Kraut is Compromise and Concession. I don't know if that really fits into this reading list, but it's about the martyrs and all the various people who died for their faith or had to stand up for their faith and the struggles that they had, because it seems like it'd be so much easier to cave and just give it all up. So much easier. But his last chapter is this beautiful little essay about the strength that is in you. You don't have to be a great man or woman like Gandhi or Joan of Arc or some heroic figure to stand up for what's right. We all have it in us. The same way I said earlier, we all have the darkness in us. We also have a great deal of courage in us to stand up against that darkness. And I guess I would say, if you've thought about it, if you thought through, this is where my red line is, this is a principle I need to stand up for, this is a thing I need to do, just jump. Just jump right into the dark if you have to. I know it's scary as hell. Hold your breath if you have to, but jump. Because the courage is in you and you will accomplish it. And when you do, it's worth it. Standing up for your neighbor, standing up for what is right, it's basically always worth it, no matter what the consequences to you are, because you don't see the fullness of your consequences. At first, you might think, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And yeah, that part's true. But the part that you can't see that's also true is that you will become a better man or woman. And you'll gain respect and you'll gain strength every time you make that choice. So I guess that's what I'd leave with you, is that the whole universe, the whole world, it's actually within you. Every heroic thing you've ever heard of, as well as the darkness, it's all in you. And that struggle, you can overcome.
Awesome. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.